I think we are live. I think we're live. I think we're live. Okay, we should be live. Hello, everybody, and welcome. This is the Apostate Prophet. I hope you're having a fantastic day. As far as I can see, and as far as I can perceive and understand with the limited abilities of a mere human being, I do understand that we are live at the moment, and I am here with Dr. David Wood. David, how are you doing?
How are you doing? But I got to go over to your channel because I don't believe it until I see it.
So we are live. You better believe me.
See. Oh, I see us.
You better believe me.
Seeing is believing.
Yeah. We can talk about that forever. But yeah, so we are live today, and we want to finally have a conversation. We haven't been live in quite a while. We want to talk about a certain interview that I had with the Bart Ehrman a few days ago, and that I published, which I think is fantastic.
Yeah, especially for being like 30 minutes.
Yeah.
30 minutes. Like when I see like 2 and 3 hour videos, I already know ahead of time there's like a 0.0002% chance that I might watch it, but a 30-minute video, I'll check that out.
Mm-hmm. Well, the thing is, I was in touch with Bart Ehrman before this, that there was a possibility of collaborating, of talking about things, because I always thought it could be useful to talk to him because, Muslim apologists tend to appeal to him and misuse his views and conclusions. And I'm aware of that because I looked at his views, I looked at his books, and the conclusions that he comes to are totally not in alignment with the Muslim apologist conclusions. So I thought I should probably get him and talk with him. But I kind of that was kind of stalling. But then I saw that he with Muhammad Hijab, and then I thought, okay, now let me jump in and ask a few questions. So
it's the same thing that happens with all of Islamic apologetics, as far as I can tell, over and over and over again. So for centuries, they claim that Muhammad is in the Bible. And they claim that Muhammad's in the Bible in areas where there aren't a lot of Christians or Jews around to respond, right? So they work themselves into this frenzy about Muhammad's all over the Jewish and Christian scriptures, and they know it and so on. But it's short-term gain, long-term loss, because eventually we start going through those and showing that, hey, Muhammad's a false prophet according to both the Old Testament and the New Testament. What's going on there? It's been corrupted, right? So, and then you've got, for all these years, they say there's no difference. There's no textual variant in any Quran manuscript ever. None. 100% of Quran manuscripts agree on every single letter. And so they use that for years, knowing that there aren't a lot of people responding to them. Eventually, some people respond, and it turns out total nonsense. The same thing with science. The Quran is confirmed by science. Works great. And so you have people actually going through the Quran and looking up these supposed scientific miracles and so on. And it's what they do with people like Bart Ehrman, right? They'll go to Bart Ehrman, look for anything that they can kind of twist into something that would agree with what they're saying, ignore everything else that he's saying that would completely destroy their belief if they took it seriously. And that's just the method. I've never seen anything, not theistic, not atheistic, nothing. I've never seen anything that uses this level of cherry picking and twisting. There's nothing else like it. And it's their apologists across the board. And so, yeah.
And they took the opportunity to distort my interview with Bart Ehrman as well.
How did they do that, by the way? I haven't seen it. So
I will talk about it. I mean, I'm preparing a video about that right now, in which I will, demonstrate clear proof that these Muslim apologists are distorting footage blatantly to make it look like he's saying something that he's not.
Wait, hang on. Again, I haven't seen this. I would imagine what they did is they went through your 30-minute interview, found some short clips where he's saying something that they could use to support them, and then completely ignore everything else he said, which would completely demolish them. But notice, if that's what they did, then check this out. This is hilarious, right? They go through Ehrman's views, which if they adopted Ehrman's methodology, they would have to reject Islam. No question about it, right? He approaches these things as a critic, as an atheist critic, responding to the New Testament and so on. And so just to give an example, so Ehrman rejects the virgin birth, right? If he rejects the virgin birth, accounts in Matthew and Luke, then what do you think he's going to accept it in the Quran, which is way later? No, that would be insane. It would be insane. So it's insane to appeal to Ehrman and say, hey, we love the conclusions he's coming to over here. We're going to use those. When if you applied his methodology for 5 seconds to Islam would come crumbling to the ground. And so let me get this straight. What they're doing is, for basically, 15 years that I can recall, Muslim apologists are quoting Bart Ehrman. You see, this guy is showing that we're right about the Bible, and we're right about this, and we're right about that. And then people come along, you come along, and say, well, actually, Bart Ehrman, do we know that Jesus died by crucifixion? Of course we know that. It's an indisputable fact, something along those lines, right? And then what they do is then they go through your interview, which is correcting their massive misuse of Ehrman, and then they massively misuse your video using the same extreme delusional cherry picking method that they've been using for 14 centuries. And so and then it's hilarious that we're talking about that now. And then watch, they'll do it with something we're saying in this video, and then they'll twist it into something that agrees with them. And then if we respond to that, then they'll twist that into something that agrees with them, cherry pick that. It's an amazing religion.
You will see their comments in a little bit. I already saw earlier comments of people saying that they will be closely watching this live stream to see things that we are going to talk about. But I want to also clarify quickly why we are talking about this whole thing. Why so much about Bart Ehrman? The issue is I'm an ex-Muslim atheist, very much convinced of it. David Wood is a convinced Christian. Bart Ehrman, on the other hand, is an ex-Christian atheist who criticizes Christianity. We are mainly talking about this, and we are mainly involving Bart Ehrman into this discussion, not because we want Bart Ehrman to help us, debunk or destroy Christianity or Islam. That wouldn't make sense. We are primarily doing this because there is this whole Islamic advance and these abuses from Muslim apologists who use Bart Ehrman. And if you ask Bart Ehrman himself, he's not very pleased with that, and you will see that in the footage. You can see that in the interview that I had with him. He's not pleased by the fact that Muslims really use him. He says, you can't really use me to prove that Islam is truer than Christianity. And that is the entire reason why we're doing this. And on top of that, Bart Ehrman does present some points which are a huge problem for Islam. But how about we just jump into it, David? We can start watching the interview, go through the steps, and then we can comment on them. What do you think?
All right.
Okay, let's do that. So I will share it on the screen here. There you are. Here we are. That's funny. Here we are. And we can skip the intro and come right to the interview.
Got no audio.
You have no audio? Okay,
I did before when you showed it to me.
Oh yeah, okay. I forgot to click something here.
You tested it right before the show, and now
Bart Ehrman. No?
There we go. Got it.
Okay, fantastic. All right, here we are starting. How are you doing?
I'm doing well, thanks.
I basically just addressed it, but in case I didn't capture it very well, would you briefly tell us? Okay, I can skip this part. He's going to talk about the seminar. I can come directly to the questions.
We know Bart Ehrman.
Yeah, in regards to that, first off, I'm sure you have come across the fact that many Muslim apologists kind of seem to appeal to you and quote you and try to kind of I would say use you in order to validate their Islamic beliefs. What do you think about that? How much do you think your findings and ideas are in alignment with Islamic understandings of Jesus and Christianity? David, by the way, whenever you need to say something, just tell me to pause.
You got, if I recall, I watched this once right before I shared a link to it. But I've watched this once. If I recall, you got through, I don't know, 12, 13, 14, 15 points or questions in this video. So if that's only 30 minutes long, then it's like an average of probably like 2 minutes or so per point. So you could basically watch like one point at a time or something like that.
Okay,
we could discuss it.
Let's do that.
So this is kind of a humorous side of this that you probably don't know, which is that the two groups that most missionaries and apologists who most like to use me are Muslims and Mormons. Go figure. I think both groups are interested in showing that their own scriptures are important. And in the case of Muslim apologists, the idea is that the Quran doesn't have any of these problems, and therefore Islam is a superior religion. I'll tell you where I would agree. When it comes to the New Testament Gospels and the entire New Testament, we have many thousands of copies, and they do have lots and lots of differences among them. Hundreds of thousands of differences among our copies of the New Testament, but most of those differences are completely insignificant. Like, they don't matter for anything. We're counting like misspelled words and things like that. So they don't. But some of them do matter. They affect how you might understand a passage or a book or the entire New Testament. And the Quran is just not like that. Obviously, I mean, the Quran has been faithfully copied for many, many centuries. So that part is absolutely right. That, in my opinion, does not make Quran a superior book. It means it's a better copied book. It is possible to make many, many copies of a book without making any mistakes, and it has no bearing on whether the book is true or not.
Yeah.
I mean, the example that I use with my Christian audiences usually is that, Adolf Hitler's Mein Kampf is in millions of copies without a single letter different among them. There's no bearing on whether you want to believe it or not. Which is, he got copied well.
Yeah, if the original text is flawed, then it doesn't really matter how much it has been preserved. The end result would also be flawed, right?
You do have a better idea what the author said with the Quran, because in some places of the New Testament there are debates, but it doesn't mean that what he said is true. And so that's a whole different question. And you can't really use me to show that Islam is truer than Christianity, because I don't.
What about the idea that okay, so that was the first question about what he thinks about the fact that Muslims generally use him to kind of make a point for their own religion. I have to tell you something in advance. The Muslim apologists who took the footage here, what they did was, as you can probably predict, they took the part until he says, insofar, they are right. And then they cut it, because after that he says, but it doesn't matter if it's preserved or copied, because that doesn't make it right. Mein Kampf is also preserved, but you can't use that to believe in Mein Kampf. And he also says you can't use me to prove that Islam is truer than Christianity. So they cut that part out, because it's just
it's almost like going to a verse of the Bible and claiming that it predicts the coming of Muhammad, and then ignoring everything else which calls Muhammad a false prophet in the exact same passage, right?
Absolutely.
It's almost exactly like that. As far as here's what's interesting: if the apologists would make any effort to understand what Ehrman is actually saying, or what his actual positions are, they could never use him. They can only use what Ehrman says, because they know that their listeners are ignorant of what he really means by these things. It's the only way they can use him. So he says there are lots of textual variants in the manuscripts of the New Testament. That's true. But notice, what Muslims need to be the case is basically textual variants that somehow support Islam, right? So in other words, they need some sort of New Testament documents where Jesus didn't die on the cross, he didn't rise from the dead, and he's not Lord, he's not the Son, right? That's what they need. You don't have that anywhere. I mean, Ehrman even pointed out the vast majority of textual variants have no effect on meaning. There are things like spelling differences. When he talks about some of them actually impacting the meaning, you still don't get anything that affects basic Christian doctrine, like Jesus' death on the cross or his resurrection or something like that. So you have variants, and you only have two really sort of big variants. That's the passage where the woman caught in adultery is brought to Jesus, and then there's the longer ending of the Gospel of Mark. So you have two sort of long passages, and in that ending of the Gospel of Mark, for instance, the longer ending, you have Jesus saying that his followers will be in situations where where they could drink poison or something like that, and it won't affect them. And so you don't have that. You don't have that in the rest of the New Testament. So you could say that variant actually affects something. It affects our understanding of things that will happen to Christians or something like that. Even then, you still don't get anything that affects Jesus' death, resurrection, or deity. So Ehrman pointing out that you have lots of variants in the New Testament. Again, the overwhelming majority are things that are inconsequential. They have no impact on meaning. The ones that do affect meaning don't affect any basic doctrine. And what's interesting is that's now the position of people like Shabir Ali, who now admits that there are variants in the manuscripts of the Quran. There are variants even in Qurans today. So he points out that Muslims in areas of Africa use Qurans, and he says they're slightly different. They don't affect any core Islamic doctrine. So they'll affect the meaning of the verse, but they're not like changing Tawheed or something like that, right? So what Muslims need is for massive corruption of basic doctrine. That's not what Ehrman is saying you have. He's saying you have a lot of variants because you have a lot of manuscripts. They're handwritten copies. Whenever you have human beings writing copies, you're going to get mistakes. The more manuscripts you have, the more mistakes you're going to have. But there's this whole field of textual criticism, right? Where you can compare the thousands of manuscripts we have, and you basically give a little crash course here. You have variants that are meaningful. They change the meaning, and you have variants that are viable. Viable means they could go back to the original. So in other words, if you have 5,000 manuscripts and some difference, some variant appears in a manuscript from the 12th century, and that's the first time you ever see it, well, it's not viable. There's no way you're going to think that actually goes back to the original. It's obvious that someone in the 12th century made some sort of mistake. So the number of when you're talking about the variants that are actually meaningful and viable, they change the meaning of the text, and they could go back to the original. So it's disputed whether they go back to the original. That's a very, very tiny fraction of all these variants that we have. But now here's where things jump in. When a Muslim hears there are variants that are meaningful and viable, in other words, they change the meaning and they go back to they're thinking, this is what we believe. It's not what you believe. It's not within a million miles of what you believe. You believe in some original gospel where Jesus didn't die on the cross, he didn't rise from the dead, and he's not Lord. None of those variants support that view. None of those variants come within 1,000 miles, million miles of supporting that view. So the idea that what Ehrman is saying somehow supports your view is not. I mean, when I walk up to someone who's grown up on a diet of Ahmed Deedat and Zakir Naik, they go, what about your 27 Bibles or your 70 Bibles? Or they just come up with some number. What about? And I'm like, what are you talking about? You're talking about translations? What are you talking about? No, all the different Bibles. And they really think that there are all these different Bibles that are just like completely different. And we just pick the ones that we like, and you go to a different area and they just have a completely different Bible. That's not that's not how it is, guys. You got the manuscripts. The manuscripts are disagreeing on very little, and you never get manuscripts that disagree on these basic core Christian doctrines. So that's the situation over there.
I think one thing that needs to be clarified is that when Muslims look at what Bart Ehrman says about the whole idea that there are certain differences in manuscripts in the New Testament or in biblical scripture, whereas as he says, and we can come to that as well, as he says, the Quran is in comparison faithfully preserved. The issue is Muslims think this is a big goal for Islam, a big score for Islam. They think this completely affirms Islam and makes Islam superior because they think of all religion and of all scripture just the way they think about Islam. Because Islam is the religion that makes this big claim that Allah sent down a scripture verbatim, word for word. It is exactly His word, and this exact word will be preserved just like that, and it must be uninterrupted from the beginning to the end. If there is any variance in that, if there's any human intervention in that, then it is false and all that. But that's not really how Christianity works, right? That's not how the New Testament works. That's not how the Gospels work. It is very much within the understanding of Christian of the Christian religion, that it is not meant to be that way. Christians don't boast about this, something like the perfect preservation, or the perfect copying, or whatever it is. It is very clear that you have accounts written down by certain people. You have the same stories told in different ways, and you have certain manuscripts of these Gospels, of these New Testaments, that give you a certain story. You are not desperately trying to look for some perfect preservation of the identical text, word for word, letter for letter, I don't know, symbol for symbol, as it is in the Quran. You don't have that in the Quran, but you are not supposed to desperately look for that within Christianity. That's an Islamic concept. You need to get rid of that Islamic concept.
Yeah, and so matter of fact, let me read a comment right here, and this will lead into a quick response. But Quillian said, "Hi, AP and DW. Would you say that the idea that variants do not change the core meaning or teaching of the Quran is similar to the Christian apologetics about the Bible?" Yes, yes, it's very similar. So my view is anytime you have human beings copying by hand a long book, you're going to get variants, right? You could try this. You can sit down and copy by hand a long book. You're going to make some mistakes. If you're a professional scribe, you'll make fewer mistakes than some random person. But in the early centuries of Christianity, where Christianity is a persecuted religion, a lot of times if you wanted a copy of a book of the Bible in your church, you had to get whoever could write and to write you out a copy. So you had to get a copy from another church, then handwrite that. So you're going to have lots of variants. That's the idea of textual criticism, is if you have copies of the manuscripts and they're circulating in Southern Europe, and you have copies that are in Northern Africa, and you have copies in the Middle East, you can start comparing these. And you can say, okay, well, we can kind of tell where these differences arose and so on. There's nothing there that supports Islam, because what you need is some original that supports Islam and doesn't line up with Christianity. You never have that. Now, the other problem, which Ehrman talks about there, is he says the Quran isn't like that. And I'm wondering here how much he knows, because here's the thing. I will say this, AP.
But he said it before on Mohammed Hijab's interview. He said, "I'm not a scholar. I can't comment fully on this, but as far as I know," and he didn't specify that here, but that's basically the background of it.
That might be an interesting interview. Get Bart Ehrman on and say, Ehrman, you said you don't know about a lot of this stuff. Let me read you some passages from the Muslim sources and see if you can see a problem, if you think there's a problem. And just read a passage about Uthman burning all the manuscripts to cover up all the variants and so on. Read about, passages being eaten by a sheep and things like that. Because, notice, Aisha says that was in the Quran up until Muhammad died, and then a sheep ate the verses. Well, notice, this would be very similar. So is that supposed to be in the Quran, or is it not supposed to be in the Quran? It actually affects the meaning, is whether women should be breastfeeding adults. It affects some practice. So notice it's very similar to the situation of the longer ending of Mark, where hey, are Christians going to be in situations where they drink poison and survive, or not? Right? It's actually affecting something about what Muslims are supposed to do, or what Christians might do, or something like that. So it's a very similar situation, but he might not know about any of that. But notice, here's the thing. Ehrman says that the Quran is a better copied book than the New Testament. Now, I'm not sure about that, because we just don't have a lot of information on the Muslim sources. And there was this tendency to cover up and burn manuscripts and so on. So there's always been a tendency to cover up the evidence and so on. And so we're in a situation where we're aware of New Testament variants. As you're pointing out, Christians don't try to cover this up, right? You go into any Christian bookstore, find a book on New Testament textual criticism. Any Bible that you get that includes comments at the bottom, that includes notes at the bottoms, will tell you when there's a variant. Will tell you when there's a significant variant. You'll read it, and then it'll say, you'll see a note at the bottom that says some manuscripts say this, and it'll have what the other manuscripts say. So we don't cover that up. In Islam, they've got the variants. I made a video. Dan Brubaker showed one page of a Quran manuscript that he took a page of, and there were 11 variants on one page of a Quran manuscript. That's aside from the differences in modern, the modern editions of the Quran But the real issue is, early on in Islam, you had these differences. Even Muhammad's scholars were disagreeing on what's supposed to be in the Quran, and they just have to kind of put their foot down and say, we're going with the 114. You, Ubay ibn Ka'b, and your 116, you get lost. You, Ibn Masud, and your 111, you get lost. We're sticking with 114, and we're going to burn all the people's manuscripts that had all these variants. I think Ehrman would regard that as a pretty big problem, because what he said was, since it's been better copied, better preserved, you have a better idea of what the original author said. Yeah. But notice, if you're burning all these variants, and there were differences and disagreements among even the top reciters, you got a problem there, because you destroyed all the hope of getting to the original back then. Whereas there wasn't this tendency in Christianity. So that might be an interesting idea.
Let me add something quickly, a few ideas. First off, this needs to be highlighted, what you just said. The whole thing that, when you open the Bible, when you look at the Bible, it tells you in some variants it says this, or in some manuscripts it says this. I mean, you can even do the same thing with the most prominent Christian websites, which give you, Bible verses. They will clearly give you the commentary and say, in certain manuscripts it says this, or in certain variants it says this. So this is something that has been part of Christian scholarship forever. When now Muslims come out and comment on the Bart Ehrman interview and say, "Oh, look, Bart Ehrman exposed Christianity. He said there are variants of the New Testament." Then what are you talking about? This is what this is what Christians themselves are saying. Yeah. The other thing that I want to say is, I had an interview with Shadi Nasser, who is a scholar on the whole topic of the Quranic texts, of Arabic texts, of Quran preservation, and so on. Now, he said to me very clearly, look, he said the following. He said, what we know is that we have certain Quran manuscripts, and it is very likely that they go back to a single source, be it a single manuscript or a single person. He said, we cannot prove this, but this is most likely true. What he said then, however, is, we do not exactly know. There is no way that we can prove that the Quran which we have is exactly in that shape and form and in those words as it was, spoken or recited at some point in the beginning. There is no way for us. It is impossible for us to prove that the Quran has been perfectly preserved, including from the moment it was, spoken, it originated. It is simply impossible. We can say that it has been, to a certain extent, faithfully copied as far as we see right now, although there are some problems between the manuscripts, but it is impossible to say it is the same as it was at the very beginning. And this Shadi Nasser said this. Many other scholars in the field will say this. I spoke to a scholar who will unfortunately not speak to me in public, but he told me this in even more detail in the background. And you can talk about copying as much as you want. What you don't have is proof that the Quran that you have right now is the same Quran that Muhammad supposedly recited word for word. It's simply not possible.
Yeah. So notice, and we probably wrap up after this. Notice the appeal to Ehrman. The reason for it is because of a lie told by Muslim apologists. So Muslim apologists a while back started circulating the myth that the Quran's been perfectly preserved right down to the letter, right? And so they're saying, hey, our book's been perfectly preserved right down to the letter. The Bible, they've got all these textual variants. And so, we're superior. Our book is superior, right? So notice it's a lie. It's a lie, right? And then, so they start using Ehrman because Ehrman talks about all these textual variants in the Bible. And they pretend that he's agreeing with them, even though if they took him seriously, he does not agree with them. He doesn't get them anywhere close to what they actually need. So the reason for the appeal to Ehrman is because of a lie and then a further deception. The lie, the Quran doesn't have textual variants. And then the further distortion of Ehrman acting like he's pointing them towards an original text that could line up with Islam. So it's a lie. Yeah. But notice if they were honest and would say, oh yeah, and the Quran has tons of textual variants in the manuscripts and so on. Then what's your complaint? Why would you appeal to Ehrman? What do you need Ehrman for if the Quran is in a similar boat in terms of having textual variants, and especially if you're burning the manuscripts and so on, all these verses that were lost and so on? Why are you appealing to Ehrman to show that there are textual variants in the Bible when you've got textual variants in the Quran? But notice here, suppose Ehrman is right. I suspect he may be, as far as the comparing the preservation of the New Testament and the Quran. If you ignore some of the stuff about burning manuscripts, which makes me awfully suspicious, if you throw out some stuff like that, let's just say from the time of Uthman down, right? Let's say from the time of Uthman, Islam had a conscious effort to standardize the text earlier than Christians did. So when the Christian writers wrote their books, they didn't write the New Testament as a book. They sent out individual books. Paul sent out individual letters. The Gospel of Mark just circulated as the Gospel of Mark. It's not put together into the New Testament until later. And again, for the first 3 centuries, Christians are a persecuted minority. They don't have, schools of, manuscript writing and editing and things like that. They don't have that, right? So you're going to get lots of textual variants. Whereas Islam, they were able to consolidate power more quickly and to sort of impose a standardized Quran much more quickly, right? So you could say, based on that, you'd have to go through the manuscripts to actually verify. But let's just say it wouldn't be very surprising to me if the Quran had fewer variants than the New Testament manuscript. Someone would have to go through and count, right? But notice, that's not what Muslims are saying, right? My point here is this: if Muslims were to say that the Quran has fewer textual variants than the New Testament, if they were to say, which is basically what Ehrman was saying, right? That it's been better preserved than the New Testament. He doesn't seem like he's familiar with the Muslim sources, but what Ehrman is saying there, let's say the Quran has been better preserved than the writings of the New Testament because, well, it's centuries after, right? It's centuries after, and because they were able to impose a standardized version earlier, and therefore ended up with fewer textual variants. What in the world does any of that have to do with something miraculous, right? And Ehrman points out, you've got Hitler's Mein Kampf. It's much better preserved. Why? Because it's much more recent, right? It's much more recent, and you have better methods of ensuring preservation right now than you did in the ancient world. Nothing miraculous there. But notice, Muslims could come out, Muslim apologists, if they were honest, could come out and say, you see, we have fewer text. If they actually did the math, counted all the numbers, they could come out and say, you see, we have fewer textual variants in the Quran than you do in the New Testament. Ha ha! But they don't want to say that because the point would be, so what, right? We have an idea. We would have an idea why you have fewer textual variants. You're burning manuscript, doing all kinds of stuff, right? And you're able to impose a standardized text earlier. So it wouldn't be much of an issue. But at least you could be honest with the evidence and make that sort of claim if you actually did the counting. But that's not what they say. The perfect preservation right down to the letter from the time of Muhammad, and Bible, oh, it's so corrupt, no one has any idea what the original said. And so they lie about the Bible, they lie about the Quran. Everything always has to involve a lie. And when you get to situations where they can actually be honest and say, okay, we've done the math, we've counted the variants in the New Testament, we've counted the variants in the Quran, and we've concluded that the Bible has more, right? If you were to do that and make an honest argument, it wouldn't go anywhere. So what do they have to do? They have to lie about the Quran. It's been perfectly preserved, and they have to lie about the New Testament. It's just one disaster, and who knows what it said. There are these 70 different Bibles out there. That lie. And somehow they'll take a little clip of what Ehrman said, knowing that their listeners that they've been feeding complete nonsense for decades are going to interpret what he says as they want him to interpret, and not as what Ehrman actually meant.
We'll have many more examples of that to come. I should turn on a timer for you to talk. Like, you can only keep your responses to 2 minutes, and not.
Well, we probably said most of what we would want to say, because that's the big. That's Ehrman's area, right? Is textual criticism.
Yeah. Okay. Let's move on. But I want to emphasize again. Bart Ehrman compared the Quran to Mein Kampf here. In Mohammed Hijab's interview, he compared it to a phone book. So I have no idea why people still keep using him as support for the Islamic narrative. So in Islam, there is this whole understanding that Jesus was merely a prophet sent by Allah or God, and he merely came to deliver a book called the Gospel. Now, this is very foggy. It's very hard to understand and to debate what exactly is being said. But the Quran refers to the book of the gospel that was given to Jesus, that was sent by Jesus. According to our understanding and according to your findings, is it plausible to say that Jesus was indeed on a mission to deliver a certain scripture, a certain book to his disciples, and that got completely lost without any traces?
No, I'd say that's completely implausible, and I don't think that's right historically. Jesus didn't hand his disciples a book. Jesus didn't have a book. My view is that Jesus certainly couldn't write himself. He was, and I don't know if he could read. It's interesting. There's only one passage in the New Testament where Jesus is said to be able to read. And it's a later passage, and so I don't know. He was raised. I'm talking about the historical Jesus now, the actual man Jesus. He was raised in a very small little place called Nazareth, which, we're not sure how large it was, but they've dug it up, and it was a small place. There were no public buildings, just kind of really a very bare housing, stones put together, basically with thatched roofs or whatever. But so there were no schools or anything, and probably he didn't actually go to school. And so I don't know if he could read or not, but the idea that he had a book of any kind and then passed it on is implausible, and it's nowhere in our early sources that says that. So I don't think that's what's going on. The Gospels that we have are written 30 or 40, 50 years later. And so there's nothing to suggest that his disciples couldn't read, by the way. I mean, two of them, Peter and John, are actually said in the New Testament to be illiterate. Acts chapter 4, verse 13, they're agramatoid, they can't read. So I don't think he was passing on books to them.
Okay, there are certain aspects to this, what we just heard. One thing is, he says there was certainly no book that Jesus delivered. The other thing is the question whether Jesus was supposed to have a book or not, because Muslims try to argue on what is actually being said when the Quran talks about Jesus being given a gospel. It could be that it's just his message or it's a book, but the problem is that the Quran makes many statements that make it look like there is a book that was given to Jesus, and this is also a very prominent opinion among Islamic scholars. The other thing is a point where many people, including you, probably would disagree, where he says that Jesus could probably not read or write, or that he certainly could not write. How do we want to proceed with this one?
Yeah, I mean, it depends. So he points out that you have a passage in Luke where Jesus is reading. So there's that. There's also a reference to Jesus writing. That's in the Gospel of John, and that is from one of the two main disputed passages that I referred to. So that passage in John. So it's basically how seriously do you take these passages? Ehrman wouldn't take them very seriously. And so what a lot of the more critical scholars will do is just sort of do a rough probability estimate in their heads, right? Because there are obviously people who could read in the first century. And so it would be like, okay, what are the chances that a random person could read, especially some person from a small little place like Nazareth? What are the chances that he could read? Pretty slim. Do I have something in the New Testament that could overpower that? Meaning, I have very clear, very early references saying that Jesus could read. No, I don't. Well, I'm just going to go with the assumption then that he probably couldn't read. And you can make a case for that with someone like Peter. I mean, these are fishermen. Is it possible that these fishermen learned to read? Sure. How likely is it? Well, you're going to have some other reason to think that. There are apostles that you would say very likely could have read. So Matthew was a tax collector. He would have had to keep some notes, and so he most likely would have been able to read in order to get his job. And so it would make sense that we have a Gospel of Matthew. He'd be one of the people that you could say could actually write. But yeah, I mean, apart from that, notice Ehrman's. It's basically if you take Luke seriously, Jesus could read. If you don't, then you don't. So he's approaching it from a critical perspective. Mm-hmm. And notice the conclusion there. Well, I don't have much of a reason to think that Jesus could read or write. So what sense does it make to say that he brought a book? And so what Muslims would have to say is, well, Jesus brought a book in the same way that Muhammad brought a book, right? He's just reciting things to his followers that are written down as a book. But as Ehrman said, there's no you don't have any evidence of
Yeah,
that
yeah.
anywhere. No one mentions this book. And Muslims will say, but it says Jesus brought the gospel. Yeah, gospel in Greek just meant good news, right? He's bringing the good news, right? That would normally be spoken good news, that Jesus is bringing the gospel. When Christians write the gospel, then they start writing books that are called the gospel because they contain Jesus preaching the gospel, and the Christians, early Christians, using this message to show what the gospel is. But notice, I mean, Muslims, you're the ones saying we need to listen to Ehrman and we need to go with his conclusions. There's no evidence anywhere that Jesus had a book that he put out as the gospel. No evidence. And notice the only gospel that we ever have are like Matthew, Mark. I mean, to go back to the first century, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. He mentions that there were probably some earlier ones, because in Luke mentions other earlier gospels and so on. You have nothing anywhere that was ascribed to Jesus, that this is the gospel that Jesus sort of put down or dictated to his followers the way Muhammad would dictate. So
what I think needs to be emphasized here is that Bart Ehrman also, takes the Gospels as, to a large part, as an accurate account of the things that Jesus did and said. Of course, he says that these are later accounts that ascribe certain qualities to Jesus, which may not be entirely accurate because they believed in him. That's his conclusion. But he does acknowledge that these accounts are very much accurate. That Paul's accounts about him are very much accurate, especially in the undisputed epistles. And as he points out, there is no hint, nothing anywhere within the scripture, within the gospels, within the letters, which says that Jesus was reciting something, reciting a book, reciting the words of God, which people are supposed to remember or write down, or anything of that sort. This entire narrative is entirely unfamiliar to early Christianity. It's entirely unfamiliar to Christian scholarship. It doesn't exist. There is no such thing. So the Islamic assertion, the Muslim assertion, or the Quranic assertion that Jesus was given a book that, according to certain Quran verses, Allah taught Jesus the Torah and gave him the gospel and all these things. These are simply claims that are not supported in any way and that don't seem to make sense given the evidence that we have, as also Bart Ehrman concludes. So this clearly does not support the Islamic perspective.
And notice there are bigger problems from for the Islamic perspective. So it's not just that Jesus brought a book called the Injil, the gospel. A little side problem there is the word Injil is a transliteration of the Greek word evangelion, right? Yeah. So Muslims, why did Jesus speak Greek in the Bible? Why's your New Testament written in Greek? Jesus didn't speak Greek. Wait a minute. According to the Quran, the name of the book is Injil, and that's a transliteration of a Greek word, evangelion. So why did Jesus have a book with a Greek title would be the question. Mm-hmm. So a little side note, but keep in mind, it's not just Jesus brought a book and then that book was lost or something like that. The Quran says that Christians still had the gospel in the 7th century when Muhammad is receiving the Quran. Mm-hmm. Surah 7, verse 157 of the Quran talks about Jews and Christians who are reading the Torah and the gospel and finding these references to Muhammad. Chapter 5, verse 47 of the Quran commands Christians to judge by the gospel, not by the Quran, according to the gospel. Surah 5, verse 68 of the Quran says that Jews and Christians have no ground to stand upon unless we stand upon the Torah and the gospel and all the revelation that has come to us. So it's not just that Jesus brought some book and that book was lost. If that, you could say, well, there's just no evidence for that. It's the Quran's claim is that Jesus brought a book, and then that book was faithfully preserved through the 1st century, into the 2nd century, into the 3rd century, into the 4th century, into the 5th century, into the 6th century, and into the 7th century, all the way down in Arabia, where Christians still had the faithfully preserved gospel. Now, the reason you've got a problem here is because if you were to just go to history and say, what book did Christians have from the 1st century all the way down to the 7th century, you're dealing with the four gospels, which during the time of Muhammad were referred to as the gospel or the fourfold gospel. They were treated as a unit, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. So either the gospel that the Quran is referring to is our gospel, in which case Islam is false because it doesn't line up with our gospel. Or the Quran is saying that Christians had this book of Jesus for 7 centuries, and it had spread from all over the place, all the way down into Arabia, and yet we don't have one reference to it anywhere ever until Muhammad comes along. That would be insane. So, guys, either Islam is false, or you're making the biggest conspiracy claim in all of history, that somehow there was this original gospel was preserved for centuries, and somehow someone was able to completely cover it all up without a single reference anywhere.
It says right here, and let the people of the gospel judge by what Allah has revealed therein. And whoever does not judge by what Allah has revealed, those are the defiantly disobedient. What is this? Is Allah here trying to mock people and saying, let them judge by what is in the gospel? But they don't have the gospel. Ha ha. No, this is a text which says, let them judge by the gospel.
Yeah, there's a rule in ethics that ought implies can, right? If I'm telling you you ought to do something, if I'm giving you a command, I'm assuming that you can do it, that you're capable of doing it, right? So if Allah is commanding us to judge by the gospel, the assumption there is that we're able to judge by the gospel, in which case we would have to have the gospel. Same thing in Surah 5, verse 68. If Allah is saying we have no ground to stand upon unless we stand upon the gospel, the assumption there is that we can stand upon the gospel. And the only way we can do that is if we actually have it. And so the Muslim idea that the Quran is simply that according to the Quran, the gospel has been corrupted and it's unrecognizable and you can't trust it and so on. That's why you need the Quran. I'm sorry, but that's not what Allah and Muhammad said ever.
Absolutely.
So what Muslim apologists are saying doesn't just, they're not just going against Bart Ehrman by twisting his words. They're doing the same thing with their God and their prophet. So notice, a Muslim apologist takes what he believes. He goes out, finds Bart Ehrman, twists Bart Ehrman's words into something that agrees with Islam. Then he has to go also and twist Allah's words and twist Muhammad's words to get them to agree with what the apologist is saying. There's I can't think of anything like this, anything in history, no cult, anything that twists things and cherry picks on this level. And I just have to conclude, AP, I don't think the true religion needs this sort of thing. I don't think so.
I agree. I will quickly run through some super chats. Oliver Spiridon said, I am generous. I appreciate it very much. In different super chats, we have from the very beginning, Stop Scamming Man said, Quran says the bones of the unborn form first and then the skin goes over it. I was totally shocked there were any parents that fall for it. This is covered by my scientific mistakes of the Quran. It's indeed true. Stop Scamming Man said, apologists invoke non sequiturs and pseudoscience to sanitize what Muhammad did to Aisha. Maybe interview a relevant scientist on the claims. I should do that. I have kind of said it. I have made up my mind on actually inviting certain people or certain sources to talk about the whole child marriage thing, since we have actual apologists in our time who say that is a wholesome value, child marriage, that should be brought back.
Yeah, there's even that clip of Ali Dawah saying that if his daughter was 9, he would tell her she's ready for marriage. There's that Speaker's Corner clip, and then there's all the clips of him saying, "No, I never said that." But people put out the actual video clip.
But if she's ready, she can get married. Yeah, and I'm proud of that.
Connor Harris said, big fan of both of you. May Christ bless you both and good luck in your work. Thank you so much. I appreciate it. T. Ward said,
see how nice Christians are, AP?
I know. Fantastic, right? This is why people keep telling me that I'm a secret Christian. What is this supposed to? I don't even understand the logic here. Can you help me understand this? Why would I be a secret Christian? That doesn't even make sense to me. I mean, why would I be? Why would I not just be openly Christian? That would be much more beneficial to me.
Notice, here's what I really think the situation is, and I came to this conclusion very early on. Their apologists lie so much that they assume everyone else is doing it, right?
Yeah.
Their lying is just so common to the apologists and scholars, and they spend so much of their time deceiving people, twisting everything in order to mislead people. They assume that other people are doing the same thing. Yeah. And so I think that's why they will look at someone like you and say, aha, I bet he's a Christian, but he doesn't want to say he's a Christian. He wants to say he's an
Why?
atheist. And then
Why?
in the future, he'll say, "Oh, I came out as a Christian, and now you have to read my book. I'm putting out a book from Islam to atheism to Christianity. Ha ha! Everyone's buying my book." They're assuming you're doing something like that because deception is so common for them.
I haven't ever thought that far. That's very interesting.
I know how they think.
Because I'm wondering what would be the point? I mean, if I'm a Christian, I would just go out.
I just gave you the point.
I'd say I'm a Christian.
Now, if you do it, you're caught.
Yeah, that's terrible. What did you do? Anyway, I just changed my name to Secret Christian on the screen to make that to make it more visible.
Haha! The proof. Screenshot. No context. No context. Yeah. Screenshot.
T-Word said, as time goes on, more evidence are being found. As time goes on, more evidence is being found that backs the Bible. Jesus is Lord, King of Kings. Once I was blind and now I see. Congratulations to you. I happen to disagree, but I'm also an atheist and I'm blind by nature. So there's a thing. Christy C. Robinson said, thank you guys. God bless you. Thank you so much. I appreciate it. Linux Dog became a member and said, or is a member, and said, thank you both for your work. I really appreciate it. Thank you so much. And finally, Kafir Linda Clark said, hi, Linda Clark, said, hello, AP and David Wood. God bless you. Wait, I will read two more because one of them is very huge. David said, according to Islam, Jesus will come back and fight Gog and Magog, which were imprisoned by Alexander the Great, and they were both Muslims. LOL. I'm going to make a video about that quite soon, hopefully. And finally,
aren't those zombies according to Yasser Qadi or something? Do you ever see that where he's claiming that they're zombies?
Yeah, I think he said we shouldn't take it literally in the traditional sense. It could be this and this, and he said it could be zombies. Yeah.
Well, notice it's also a situation where, I mean, there are these tons and tons of people. Alexander the Great builds this massive wall to keep them out, and they're being held there. And I mean, if this massive wall to keep out these countless people from ever, getting to you, that's a situation where you'd expect to find, I mean, something, right?
Yeah.
Some indication, some source on what in the world this is talking about, and you just never have that.
Yeah.
I mean, we have accounts of the things that Alexander did. They don't line up with Islam. If you want to say, dual carne wasn't Alexander, we're changing it because we know that Alexander was a pagan, so we're going to say Cyrus or something like that. Where's this thing that Cyrus did? Where is it?
Yeah, I think Resident Evil may be based on the Islamic story of Gog and Magog. I don't know if you've ever played.
You see, Resident Evil proves that Islam is true. They agree with us.
And finally, RSN74 made a $100 super chat. Thank you so much, and said, AP and Dr. Wood, your video saved me from Islam. Merry Christmas. Thank you so much. Merry Christmas back to you, and very, very happy to hear that. Thank you. I appreciate it. Let's get back to watching stuff and commenting on it. Here we are. Are you ready?
Yep.
And could it be said that the earliest... Look at that. I looked like I was going to recite the Quran or something.
So I don't think he's passing on books to them.
And could it be said that the earliest Christian accounts about Jesus, that the Gospels and the Epistles are very much accurate about Jesus and about the words that he spoke? Or could it be argued that there is a huge, vast corruption of what he actually was and what he actually said?
Yeah, I mean, I wouldn't call it a corruption. What I would say is that Jesus taught his disciples, and he did things that they saw, and when he died, they told stories about them, and these stories passed along in oral circulation for a long time, for 20, 30, 40 years, before people started writing them down. We know a good deal about what happens to stories in oral traditions, even in cultures that are not literary, even in oral cultures, stories change, and when a storyteller will change a story in order to make a point, or to in light of his audience, or for all sorts of reasons, and stories get made up. And so there are stories in the Gospels that are almost certainly made up. I'll be dealing with this in my webinar on the birth stories in the New Testament, because the stories of Jesus' birth are found in only two of our Gospels, Matthew and Luke. Mark and John don't say anything about Jesus being born of a virgin in Bethlehem or anything like that. But the two accounts we have are much later. They're probably dated 50 or 60 years after his birth. And so, more like 80 or 85 years after his birth. And they have differences between them, and some of them are not plausible historically. And I think that's true of the Gospels as a whole. There is accurate information in the Gospels, I think. There's historical information in the Gospels, but what scholars have to do is to figure out what's historical and what's legendary.
You know what the funny thing is?
Hmm.
His first words as a response to my question are, I wouldn't say corrupted.
Yeah.
And the first response to this interview that I saw from Muslims is, look, Bart Ehrman confirmed that the New Testament is corrupted. Bart Ehrman said the Bible, the Gospels are corrupted. Woohoo.
Yeah. And notice that's why it's important when someone says your Bible's been corrupted. The first question should be, what do you mean? What do you mean by corrupted? Tell me precisely what you mean. If you mean there are lots of textual variants, and that's what you mean by corrupted, then you could say it's corrupted in that sense. But the Quran has also been corrupted in that sense. So if that's what you mean, right? So that's one problem. The other, I mean, this is sort of a side note. Notice he's talking about not trusting everything in like Matthew and Mark because you're several decades after the events they report. And he says, we know what happens in oral cultures. People, basically things get embellished. Sometimes people put stories into there. Sometimes people make things up. And what's funny is Muslims will look at that and go, that's right. That's why you can't trust these New Testament documents. My goodness, Muslims, your first detailed biographical source on Muhammad comes from more than a century after Muhammad. We don't use anything that comes from a century after the time of Jesus.
And we don't even have that specific, and we don't even have that specific source, right?
Yeah, we have a later edited version where he took out the most embarrassing stuff, right? And it's a source that most Muslims, when I quote it, so we don't trust Ibn Ishaq, we don't trust that. What do you trust? What can I quote? Sahih al-Bukhari, really? Written 2 centuries after the events? Sahih al-Bukhari, 2 centuries? I can't even imagine a Christian coming up and saying, hey, there's this book. It's written 230 AD, so 200 years after the time of Jesus. That's our main source that we're going to learn about Jesus. So here, the situation just once again is Ehrman is saying something. Muslims will interpret this as something that somehow vindicates their view. And if they took what he just said seriously, great. They know almost nothing about Muhammad because their main sources are way later than the source. I mean, if you're talking about the distance between the events they report and your earliest sources on them, I mean, your main sources are Sahih al-Bukhari and Sahih Muslim on the life of Muhammad. It's 2 centuries after the events. If you can't trust something 20, 30, 40 years after the time of Jesus, my goodness, what do you do with something 2 centuries? But let me guess what you're going to do. Yeah, if Christians do it, it's a problem. If Muslims do it, no, they can do it forever, and it's not a problem.
Yeah. So the problem with the whole Islamic source with Ibn Ishaq is we don't exactly have the exact writings. We have reconstructions of those according to a later source, and the biography, the earliest biography, includes a lot of stories that Muslims say are not authentic because they are mostly built on just hearsay, and they have to really filter out all the all the false information. They have to get the right information out of it. But these books exist still. The books of Ibn Ishaq, the book of Ibn Ishaq, or what is claimed is what he was written, what he wrote, is still read by Muslims. It is still part of Islamic scholarship. Muslims still read it through today, and it is a book that Muslim scholars themselves have concluded is very much unreliable to great extents. This is what you have, and with that position, with that stance, in that position, you are trying to attack the authenticity of reports about Jesus by the earliest Christians. That's kind of strange, isn't it?
Yeah, and as you pointed, so Ibn Ishaq is the earliest book we know about. We don't have an actual copy. We have a later edited version from Ibn Hisham, who admits that he took out all the embarrassing, the most offensive material. So things like the satanic verses and so on. He took that stuff out. And even then, Muslims don't trust this as their best source. They go to even later sources. So sources after we know that Muslims are sanitizing their stories to try to make them less embarrassing. Bukhari wrote, his main reason for writing is there were so many false stories. The main reason these hadith collectors started putting together books was there were so many false stories about Muhammad circulating, they had to try and get to the best of the best. And so the two things. One, here again, if you take Ehrman's claims seriously, he's approaching it from a critical perspective, right? I'm going to this. Am I going to trust a book written 30, 40, 50 years after the events it's reporting, when it includes, miraculous things? And people could be writing from a place of bias or to defend their own position. People could be making stuff up. How much am I going to trust that? And he's saying, if I have good reason, and good reasons for him would be like if I have it kind of all over the place in multiple sources and things like that. That's what he's looking for when he says we do have reliable information. He's looking for multiple independent testimony in various sources and so on. Also, things that are confirmed by Paul and things like that. That's the kind of thing that he's looking for. But if you adopt his method and say, nope, hey, this is a little too late for me to take seriously. Two things. One, you've just thrown out all your hadith, all your sources on the life of Muhammad. Throw them all out. You can't trust them. But you don't want to do that because you'd have to throw out Islam, because a lot of your beliefs don't come from the Quran. They come from the hadith. So that's problem one. The second problem is, how much do you think Ehrman would trust what the Quran is reporting about Jesus if it's not 30 or 40 or 50 years after the events? It's coming 6 centuries after the events. How much do you think is going to trust what the Quran says? If he's throwing out those very early sources, obviously he's going to throw out the Quran as a historical source on the life of Jesus. And yet what Muslims will do is say, yes, Ehrman is our champion. He's agreeing with us. He supports us. When if you took him seriously for 5 seconds, you'd have to throw out everything in the Quran that talks about Jesus, and you'd have to throw out all your sources on Muhammad. So you destroy Muhammad and you destroy the Quran. And yet you don't do that. Why? Complete hypocrisy.
Yes, absolutely. We have to move on. We will never be done with this. Quickly, super chat. Stanislaw Yarchik said, what do you, David, think about Anthony Rogers versus Sam Shimon and William about sola fide? What do you think?
I haven't watched it, but I haven't watched any of the disputes. I don't really declare myself to be in a specific denomination or anything, but I'd be in the Protestant camp. So you'd have to, if you think they have a good argument, you'd have to have me look at it. But I've never been impressed with arguments for why I should go beyond Scripture.
Interesting. Thank you. Zagros Özkan said, David, if God... I'm not going to read that, Zagros. Stop it. I'm not going to read that. Thank you for the super chat, but I can't read that. I'm sorry. He was going to ask you a hypothetical question about belief in God and the commands that your God would give you, but I'm not going to do that. Linux Dog said, thank you both for your work. It's truly God's work. Thank you so much. I disagree, but thank you. Oliver Spiridon said, when my country will be freed from Hezbollah and the economy will rise again, hopefully, visit my country. It's full of church near mosque, and we will teach the world how to be civilized. All the best. All the best. Thank you so much. Happy Camper said, where do you think Islam will be in 10 years? Thanks, AP and David Wood. I think it will be under even more scrutiny. It will be in big trouble. And we are doing that right now. In the last 10 years, there has been so much
massive
progress
change.
And so much massive pressure. It makes me happy.
Yeah. I mean, guys, if you go back 10 years ago, it was standard.
Yeah,
for pretty much all the apologists to deny that Muhammad had sex with a 9-year-old girl. It was pretty much everyone would say perfect preservation right down to the letter. Everyone is, and now, everyone you talk to would tell you if there's no death penalty in Islam for apostasy. Everyone said, oh, here we are 10, 11 years later, and almost everyone admits that there's a death penalty in Islam. Almost everyone admits that Muhammad had sex with a 9-year-old girl. Almost everyone admits, everyone who's being honest at all, but some of their top guys are admitting, yes, we do have differences in different manuscripts in the world. Different, versions of the Quran and so on, but they don't affect the meaning so that much and so on. So things are changing. So what's it going to be in another 10?
Yeah. Interesting. And finally, Myth Vision Podcast said this was one of the best video responses to Islam I have seen from you, AP. Thank you so much. Credit goes to Myth Vision Podcast. By the way, he has been very helpful in arranging the whole issue with me and Bart Ehrman. So thank you so much. And also go over and subscribe to his channel. He has done a lot of work, and he's also promoting and helping Bart Ehrman with his seminar. Okay, let's go on to the next talking point here. What about certain sources like the Proto-Evangelium of James, for example? Certain extra biblical or apocryphal sources that were not included, in the New Testament, which tell us certain things, such as that Jesus brought, certain stones to rock birds to life, or that he spoke as a child, and things like that. What can you say about them, about their authenticity?
Yeah. Well, so I'm going to be talking about the Proto-Evangelium during the talk. The term Proto-Evangelium.
I need to clarify. I was just cringing at myself watching that, because I got completely mixed up in what I was asking, because I didn't actually want to ask that beforehand. But then I suddenly just threw that in. What I'm really asking about is there is the infancy gospel of Thomas and the infancy gospel of James. In the infancy gospel of Thomas, it mostly talks about certain miracles or certain things that Jesus did in his as a child, allegedly, according to that source. Whereas in the infancy gospel of James, it talks primarily about Mary and her birth and her early life until Jesus is born. And in the infancy gospel of Thomas, there is the story of Jesus bringing certain birds that he made from clay to life, making them actual birds and letting them fly away. And certain other stories are included in a Syriac infancy gospel, for example, where Jesus talks as a little baby. So that was the question. But yeah, let's go ahead.
Evangelium just means it means the gospel before the gospel, because it's the proto gospel before the gospel, because most of the proto gospel of James is about the miraculous birth and upbringing of his mother Mary. Mm-hmm. And what's driving the account is the question of why her? why would she be chosen? What was so special about her? And the account tries to explain that, but then it gives a very remarkable account of Jesus' birth and what happens afterwards. This is almost entirely a legendary account. It dates from the second Christian century after the New Testament Gospels, but it was heavily influential on Christian thinking throughout the Middle Ages about Jesus' birth, including, I don't know if you've seen much Christian art from the Middle Ages or in the Renaissance, but whenever they show a picture of Mary and Joseph and Jesus, right, at the birth scene, Joseph's always an old man, mm-hmm. And where does that come from? Well, it comes from the Proto-Gospel of James, the Proto-Evangelium. And so there's lots of interest. There are lots of really interesting stuff, and there's very surprising stuff in there. But it's really more valuable for seeing what Christians were saying about Jesus' birth years later, 100 years later, than it is seeing what actually happened.
I see. I bring this up because you might be familiar with the fact that Islam adopts a lot of certain stories, like Jesus speaking as a little baby, things like these that are found in some of these sources that are considered fabrications. And
well, yeah, that's right. And the story about him making birds is actually in a different gospel. That's in the gospel that's called the infancy gospel of Thomas. Mm-hmm. And he makes these 12 sparrows, and when he's accused of violating the Sabbath, he claps his hands and brings them to life, and they fly away. And so, like, he's destroyed all evidence of any misdoing. What do you mean? What birds?
That's interesting. In some of these sources, there are some very strange accounts of Jesus. I read some of the Gnostic Gospels, for example. Yeah. Things that he says and does are completely irreconcilable with the New Testament Jesus that we have.
Yeah, that's right. I mean, it's. Stories get told about famous people, and sometimes they're historical and sometimes they're not, and the task is to figure out which is which.
Mm-hmm. All right, that was a lot, and there's a lot to address here.
We can keep it pretty simple. Ehrman stuff. You're bringing this up because there are these stories about Jesus in the Quran, and when we trace them back, we can't find anything in the first century that talks about these stories. Mm-hmm. What we do find is stories that originated much later, and then the Quran is using those stories. And so Muslims, remember, Ehrman is your hero. He's the one supporting you. What would Ehrman say about these stories being in the Quran? The obvious response of anyone who's remotely critical would be Muhammad stole a bunch of stories, not realizing these are not authentic stories. He could not tell the difference between something that originated in the 2nd or 3rd or 4th century and something that originated in the 1st century and is authentic. He couldn't tell the difference, which means it doesn't look like that came from God.
Yeah. The thing is, everybody knows that Bart Ehrman doesn't believe in the divine. He doesn't believe in the supernatural. He doesn't believe in God and Christianity and all that. So some Muslims bring this strange objection and say, well, of course he says these things are legends because he doesn't believe in miracles. But that's not the point he's making. The point he's making is that we have accounts of the original story of Jesus, and these accounts, these early stories, are part of the actual story. He admits that. He says he thinks there are certain stories that are almost definitely made up in the New Testament, but these, the early story about Jesus is there, whereas these certain things that I have brought up, like Jesus turning clay birds into actual birds, or speaking as a baby, or even killing children as a child, these are stories that have nothing to do with the early story, that were made up later as legends about the character of Jesus. And he acknowledges this. He says these are not part of the actual story. These are simply later legends. I actually have the infancy gospels here, and look at the infancy gospel of Thomas, for example, and you will see that the Jesus that you find in this infancy gospel has nothing to do with he's nothing like the Jesus in the New Testament. In this part, he plays on the Sabbath and creates clay birds. Then he breathes life into them, which is, by the way, very significant. He does that in this story as a sign that he can give life to certain things. That's a sign that he's more than just human. He's not creation. He's above creation. He was there from the very beginning. And these Gospels basically also emphasize the idea that Jesus is above human. He has been there since before creation. So they run with the idea that he is God or Son of God or a representation of God or something like that. But in chapter 3 of this gospel, he gets angry at a child and curses the child, and the child immediately dries away, becomes fruitless, and dies. In chapter 4, a child merely bumps into him, where Jesus then turns around and what does he do? He curses him, and the child then dies as well. He gets angry at people for random things and curses them, and they die. People question him, and he says, "How dare you question me? May you be all cursed," and they all go blind. So this is the Jesus that you find in those accounts, which have had an influence on Middle Eastern, areas, which also probably had an impact on the Arabs and early Islam. And this has nothing to do with that Jesus from the New Testament, who preaches forgiveness all the time and who would never act this way. How can you reconcile these two things? And the Quranic accounts about Jesus come from these sources.
Yeah, I'll just reiterate something you mentioned there at the beginning, that the Muslim response here is, of course, Ehrman doesn't believe these things because he doesn't believe in God, and so he doesn't believe that Muhammad is a prophet, and so he can't believe he's that Jesus is doing these miracles, or that Muhammad is receiving these revelations. Guys, that's not the issue. I believe in miracles. I believe in God, and I believe in miracles, and yet these things are clearly legendary, and Muhammad was clearly plagiarizing these stories, as he was repeatedly accused of in the Quran. Remember, over and over and over again in the Quran, Muhammad would receive a revelation, and the non-Muslims would run up and say, these are just tales of the ancients. And even we know where Muhammad's getting this from. He's getting these stories from this guy he keeps talking to, right? And so this isn't a matter of not believing in God or something like that. It's a matter of common sense. If you've got all these first century documents, none of them mention any of these stories. How do people know all of these additional stories later on? Well, guess what? I don't have any problem with Jesus performing miracles. So I wouldn't have a problem with him giving life to clay birds. It's clearly a later fabrication, though. It's clearly a later fabrication. You have no evidence that this actually happened. The stories are too late.
Mhm.
But if you're a Muslim, you have to believe it happened because of what the Quran says. But keep in mind, and notice, you can say, hey, I just believe the Quran. I believe whatever it says. But if you're appealing to Ehrman and saying, hey, this guy's got the right methodology, how many times does he have to destroy your book and your prophet with his reasoning? Ehrman's usually not applying his reasoning to the Quran. But the idea is when you guys take his reasoning that he's applying to the New Testament and you cheer for his conclusion, even though it doesn't actually agree with you, but when you do it, you're cheering his conclusion, you're kind of cheering for the methodology that he arrived at. Well, be consistent, apply the same methodology to your own book and your own prophet, you're going to have some problems.
Let me quickly read this to you. Gospel of Thomas, chapter 4.
Oh, nice.
It says, from there, the infancy Gospel of Thomas. It says, from there he was going with his father Joseph, and someone running struck his shoulder, Jesus. Jesus said to him, cursed be you because of your leader. And immediately the child died. And the people who saw that he died immediately cried out and said, from where was this child born that all of his words become deed? And then the parents of the dead child saw what happened. They blamed Joseph, his father, saying, where did you get this child from? And so on. And this just comes after Jesus killing another child for something very simple. So this is Jesus just doing whatever he wants as a child, being reprimanded for the things that he does, and then getting even more angry and saying, how dare you question me? May you all go blind. And everyone goes blind, and so on. And the conclusion of these gospels is over and over again that this child cannot be a human. This child must be something far above human. It must be a being that existed before everything else existed. It is a divine being. So
yeah, and notice that's similar to the situation. And you guys refer to it a little bit later, I think. But it's similar to the situation where you have sources that predate Islam. They're not authentic, but they predate Islam, where Jesus doesn't actually die on the cross. God makes it look like Jesus died on the cross, or he disguises someone else. And there are situations where there's a theological reason for inventing the story. We know what we don't just know that the story was invented. We know why the story was invented. So you had groups like the Gnostics and so on, who claimed that Jesus, some of them anyway, claimed that Jesus wasn't actually a physical person. He was only divine, only kind of appeared to people. Well, the objection arose, well, how could he be nailed to a cross? How could he be crucified if he didn't actually have a human body? They wanted to say he's just divine. He's not physical. He's not human. How could he be nailed to a cross if he was just an appearance? And the response, you've either got God made it look that way or God took someone else. You need something like that. And so they come up with these alternative explanations. And then these become the Muslim positions later. And it's like, wait a minute. People came up with the position that Muhammad appeals to in the Quran to deny the humanity of Jesus. And then you use the story that is meant to deny the humanity of Jesus, and you use it for a book that's saying Jesus was just a man. It's the exact same thing when we're trying to understand why Muslims like cherry pick everything, right? Why their apologists will go to Bart Ehrman, cherry pick things that he said and use it. Why they'll go to science, try to cherry pick some things from science, and then cherry pick some verses from the Quran, and then twist what science claims and twist what the Quran says in order to get some amazing vindication of Muhammad. While they'll cherry pick verses of the Bible, which the Bible claims that Muhammad's a false prophet, while they'll cherry pick these things, notice they were doing it all along. Muhammad is cherry picking all these things from all these earlier sources. People were accusing him of it, according to the Quran. And so your prophet starts off by cherry picking and twisting everything. Shocker, that's been the case for your apologists and scholars for 14 centuries.
There are so many things to ask, like the crucifixion, exactly. Like if you look at it, you find you find crucifixion denial. So not just denying that nobody was crucified, denying that Jesus himself was crucified. You find this in certain movements within Christianity and certain movements associated with Christianity that are considered non-Christian or new religions after Christianity and so on. These are mostly Gnostic religions, dualistic religions, which consider flesh to be something very inferior or something filthy, something lowly. And these movements this even made it into Manichaeism, for example, which is a very dualistic religion, which considers the earth basically filth, and what is above that, what is divine, is the light, and that is pure. These movements came up with the idea that Jesus couldn't have been crucified because he was God, or he was something divine. He was an immaterial being, which is why the crucifixion didn't happen. Somebody else was crucified instead of him. Why do exactly Muslims adopt this view? How would it make sense for Muslims in the Islamic theology to say Jesus wasn't crucified? Why? Why? There is simply no reason to explain this. What would be the point of it? You could say, well, if Jesus was crucified, he couldn't come back later at the end, because according to the Islamic tradition, which is adopted from Christianity, he has to come back before the end. Well, that could still happen even if he died. You have resurrections in the Quran. You have people coming back to life. You have the Dajjal people who will bring humans back to life. That should be entirely possible. There is no reason for Islam to adopt the idea that Jesus wasn't crucified. There is no reason for Islam to adopt the idea of the virgin birth, which is an idea that developed to signify that Jesus is of a divine origin, or giving life to certain inanimate beings, and so on. These are all things that make no sense within the Islamic theology, and these are problems.
They are problems.
Yep, let's move on. Next thing would be, how much can we be sure about the crucifixion of Jesus, and whether he was indeed crucified?
Right. I know in Islam, the teaching is that he was not actually crucified. I think on a historical basis, Jesus was absolutely crucified. I think that there is, as a historian, there's almost no doubt about that. And in case your audience doesn't know, I don't identify as a Christian. I mean, I was raised a Christian, but I'm an atheist now. I don't have a particular stake in any of this information personally. But I think the crucifixion of Jesus is probably the best attested, one of the best attested events of his life. It's found all over the place in our early sources. It's even mentioned by non-Christian sources, and it's a kind of a complicated thing for me to argue, although I can at length if somebody wants me to. It's not the kind of thing that Christians would have made up about him if they wanted to make up legends. If they wanted to make up something about Jesus, it wouldn't be that he got killed by the enemy, tortured to death. Then what they would have made up is that he became the king and he's sitting on the throne in Jerusalem. But they couldn't make that up because everybody knew it wasn't true. And so they had to say, well, yeah, he got crucified. But then they ended up saying that because he was crucified, that was significant, that it was the plan of God. And but they're kind of explaining it. They're not, they're explaining because they got to explain it because he was crucified.
Yeah. The Islamic account is very strange. It is that I guess that people think Jesus was crucified, and that somebody was crucified, but it wasn't Jesus. It was just somebody else who people thought was Jesus, and it's a very strange thing to think.
Well, it is. And it didn't start with Islam. It actually there's a Christian teacher in the 2nd century named Basilides who was an Gnostic, and he wrote a gospel. He wrote a Gnostic gospel. We don't have the gospel anymore. We have a church father who talks about it, and in his account, what he says is that there was a fellow in the Gospels. Jesus is carrying his cross, and they impel somebody else to carry the cross for him to the place of crucifixion. And according to Basilides, what happened is this other person, whose name was Simon from Cyrene, which is in North Africa, Simon of Cyrene carries the cross, and when he gets there, Jesus pulls an identity switch. He's the Son of God. He can do miracles. He makes Simon of Cyrene look just like him. And then he looks just like Simon of Cyrene. And so the Romans think they're crucifying Jesus, but they're crucifying Simon. And Jesus is standing by the cross laughing. Presumably Simon didn't think it was so funny. Trying to help out here.
Understandably so. Yeah, so interesting.
Ehrman seems like he'd be fun to hang out. Nabil actually took some classes with him back in the day.
Oh, really?
Yep.
We very much talked about this just now before we got into it.
Yeah. Crucifixion. But notice, so Muslims, hey, we want to go with the method of Bart Ehrman. Bart Ehrman's method. The overall method, the general method is you look at your sources. You're specifically looking for multiple independent sources. So it's not just multiple sources that are all quoting the same source. That would actually be one source. Multiple independent sources. And he points out you've got Christian sources, you've got non-Christian sources. talking about the crucifixion of Jesus. Then he uses a little bit of the principle of embarrassment, meaning if you want to say Christians invented the idea of crucifixion, why would they invent that? I mean, if you're inventing a story about your hero, why would you say, oh yeah, and the people killed him? Why would you invent that sort of thing? So he looks at that and says, that's one of the things we can definitely know about Jesus. Well, notice, well, then Islam is false, right? Because Islam says it didn't happen. But in the Islamic mindset, we'll look at Ehrman's reasoning, we'll celebrate his reasoning, except for someone like Ehrman is going to say, the crucifixion of Jesus, definite thumbs up. The virgin birth of Jesus, definite thumbs down. So the exact opposite of what Islam is teaching about these issues. And yet Ehrman is our hero here. It's just this. I mean, I've never seen anything that cherry picks like this.
That's funny. I never thought about it that way.
Pretends that Ehrman is supporting them, pretends that science is supporting them, pretends that the Bible is supporting them. It's just wild. Note out, by the way, if you beat me to this, AP, if you beat me to this, you can do it before me. But I will do this if you don't do it, if you don't beat me to it. A video titled, "Why Did Allah Deceive Bart Ehrman?"
Oh,
because keep in mind, ladies and gentlemen, Muslims who are watching, everyone else, where did Bart Ehrman get the idea that Jesus' crucifixion is a fact of history? Where did he get that idea? Because according to the Quran, it never happened. According to the Quran, Jesus was never crucified. So how did Bart Ehrman conclude that this is a fact of history, and if Islam denies it, so much for Islam? Where did he get that idea? He got it from Allah, because Allah disguised someone, made someone else look like Jesus. Then this other person, usually Judas, according to Muslims today, then this other person was crucified, but everyone thought that it was Jesus. Jesus' own followers thought that it was Jesus. The Jews who didn't believe in Jesus thought that it was Jesus. The Romans thought that it was Jesus. Everyone thinks it's Jesus. Why? Because Allah did such a great job tricking everyone. And so here we are, nearly 2,000 years later. Bart Ehrman takes it as a fact of history. Why does Bart Ehrman believe Jesus was crucified? Because Allah did such a great job tricking everyone 2,000 years ago that he made all kinds of sources. And so the reason Bart Ehrman is led away from Islam is because Allah did such a great job tricking and deceiving everybody. That's some strange stuff right there.
I was going to make a video about Allah deceiving everybody in general. I wanted to make a video about how Allah created Christianity, the biggest major religion, the enemy of Islam. But yeah, that's basically a very nice.
And just so you know, you can make a big case out of it. Yeah, that Allah didn't just deceive Bart Ehrman; He also invented Christianity. Yeah. Because it's also Bart Ehrman's position. Not only was Jesus crucified, but the disciples saw something. They saw something that convinced them that he rose from the dead. So they actually believed that Jesus had risen from the dead and appeared to them. I've seen Muslims like Shabir Ali suggest that maybe Allah allowed Jesus to appear to his disciples to comfort them. And there were earlier Muslims who suggested that. And so notice, now you'd have Allah tricking people into believing that Jesus died, and then having Jesus appear to his followers, knowing that they're going to interpret this as resurrection. Where did Christians get the idea that Jesus rose from the dead? According to Islam, they got this idea from Allah, who's tricking everyone. But notice, it's also Ehrman's position, and I'm sure if I recall correctly, he'll be talking about this. It's also Ehrman's position that their belief that Jesus rose from the dead caused them to go and reinterpret passages and eventually conclude that he's divine. Yeah. So if this is correct, you've got Allah originating belief in Jesus' death, resurrection, and deity, because he's just too dumb to realize that no one's understanding what he's trying to get across.
And to that, the idea is that Jesus was born from a virgin birth, which gives people the idea, wait a minute, why does that happen? All humans are born with a father and a mother, but this one is not. So they ascribed divine origin to that. Jesus goes around resurrecting people, giving life to inanimate beings, which makes people think, wait a minute, nobody can do that. This must be something bigger than human. This must be something greater than creation. He does all these things. According to these stories, Jesus knows the answer to basically every question, and nobody does that. Only something divine can do that. So it looks very much like Allah was messing with people and was kind of pushing them to falsely believe that Jesus is God.
Yeah, and notice since you brought up the virgin birth, that's one of the things where Ehrman would believe that since Christians became convinced that Jesus rose from the dead, now they're going to the Old Testament to find these passages that make sense of this. And one of the things they conclude is that he's born of a virgin, right? It's not just he's divine, he's also born of a virgin. And so according to Ehrman, this is why Christians came up with this story about Jesus being born of a virgin. It's because they're applying these Old Testament passages because they're convinced that he rose from the dead. But wait, according to Islam, Christians only became convinced that Jesus rose from the dead because Allah tricked them into believing that Jesus died on the cross, and then somehow he's making appearances later. That makes them reinterpret these Old Testament passages and then apply the story of the virgin birth to Jesus. And then Islam ends up retaining the claim of the virgin birth why, according to Ehrman, did Christians ever come up with that to begin with? Because of the resurrection. Yeah. So this is like, this is what happens when you guys are cherry picking, and your prophet was the ultimate cherry picker and plagiarist.
I have to point out, I have thought for a long time that Islam's adoption of Jesus is so terrible. It makes no sense. It is incoherent. It makes Islam look ridiculous. There is no point for Jesus to be a part of the Islamic narrative. But we will move on, and we will hear more about that in a second. What about the I'm just shooting out a lot of questions here. I'm sorry, but when it comes to the gospel, okay, this is one of the most important parts that Muslims have distorted.
Let's see.
I
don't remember what this is.
The problem is not only that that Islam doesn't accept the Gospels and the New Testament that we have. The idea is also not only that there was a book called the Gospel and that it was lost or corrupted, but also that basically the immediate followers of Jesus, that the early Christians were basically Muslims, meaning they didn't hold any of these heretical Christian ideas, and they were completely in alignment with the Islamic religion and the Islamic way of thinking, of simply regarding him as a prophet and worshiping Allah or God alone, and so on. What could you say about that?
So I would say that there are some elements of truth in that historically, and some things I think I would consider to be problems. But on the basic level, the idea that the earliest followers of Jesus thought that he was a human and that he worshipped only one God, and they also worshipped only one God, I would say that that's true. That is true.
Okay. Only until here did the Muslim apologists show his response. They cut off the rest. Do you see what's happening here?
Yeah.
Because why? What he says so far.
Because that's what their prophet does.
Yeah.
Right.
What he says so far.
Yeah.
Is what Muslims would say. It's what Islam would say. They cut out the rest and they made it look like this is his response.
And notice. So you've got Bart Ehrman here saying that insofar as they believed Jesus was a human being and they believed in God, then yeah, that would agree with Islam. Now, I would dispute the more they learned about Jesus, the more they, you've got them bowing down and worshiping him and so on. Now, if Ehrman wants to reject those and so on, but on what basis would he be rejecting those? You've got a ton of sources. Maybe we'll cover a little bit of it, here in a minute. I'm going to just read a couple of passages, but basically, notice, they believed in one God. Alhamdulillah, they believed in one God. This proves they were Muslims, guys. Every Jew of the time believed in one God, right? Every Jew of the time, every Jew who was there believed in one God. Jesus' followers are supposedly converting to something to join him. And the ones who didn't are condemned. What are they converting to? In other words, if Jesus is coming, this is the picture of Jesus you get from the Muslim sources. Jesus is walking around going, believe in one God, believe in one God. And they want to kill him for it. That makes no sense. Every single Jew there would have said, amen, amen, preach it, go preach it to those pagans over there who believe there are all kinds of gods. Go preach to those pagans. Go, please preach to those Roman pagans over there. Do something, right? But so...
And then they killed him because...
Oh my goodness, they believed in one God. They believed in one God. This, alhamdulillah. Great, so all the Jews were Muslims because they all believed in one God. what were they converting to when they joined Jesus? Why are
Yeah.
they joining Jesus and condemned for not joining Jesus? And why wouldn't any Jew agree with him completely if he's just saying, hey, believe in one God? There's only one God, ladies and gentlemen. So this is just, so notice, I mean, everyone who believes in one God is a Muslim according to Islam. And yet we're in trouble according to Islam, because according to Islam, anyway.
Now let's listen to the rest of what he is saying about the followers of Jesus, the immediate followers of Jesus, and we will be coming to what you just mentioned a few minutes ago.
I think that these earliest Christians, though, right after his death, believed that God had raised him from the dead and taken him up to heaven. And in the ancient views, whether it's Greek or Roman or Christian or Jewish, these ancient views, if somebody's taken up to heaven, they're living with God. They are made immortal, so they don't die again, unlike everyone else who dies again. An immortal is just another name for gods in ancient Greek. Jesus was made immortal, and I think that according to his followers, and so they started worshiping him. They didn't worship him as the one only God, but he was a being who deserved worship, and so they considered him to be the Lord whom they worshipped. And I think that happened early on, but they understood that during his life he was a human.
Mm-hmm.
They would not have agreed with most of the tenets of Islam that differ from Christianity, in my judgment. That I don't think is right historically.
But so the deification or turning Jesus into a god would then have begun due to the crucifixion and due to stories about the crucifixion within a lifetime of the crucifixion, basically.
Yeah, well, yeah. But I would say at the resurrection. I would say that what happened is, he got crucified. Lots of people were getting crucified, but the difference in his case is his followers came to think that he was raised from the dead. And it's not that he had a near-death experience. It's not that he died and came back for a while and then died again. In their view, he was raised. God raised him from the dead and took him up to heaven, and that was the deification. Mm-hmm. Later Christians then started saying, well, he didn't get deified at the resurrection. He'd been God from the time he was born, and so you start getting these ideas of the virgin birth. Then people say, well, actually, he was God before he was born, so the developing understanding of Christ happens over time. But the earliest Christians, I think, did not think he pre-existed, did not think he was born of a virgin. They thought he was a great teacher who was more righteous than anyone else that God had made into a divine being.
So, okay. Now here we have so many issues and very big issues for Islam. One thing that I want to point out is what he says, and what Muslims really want to misunderstand and cling on to is he seems to be saying Jesus just believed in one God, and the people around him believed he was human and they believed in one God. Okay, but that is the minority of what he is saying. The majority of what he's saying is in complete contradiction with anything that Islam tells us, because he's saying that Jesus says a lot of things according to the Gospels, and Bart Ehrman himself says that he thinks the authors of the Gospels consider Jesus God. That's what he believes in. That's what he says. And he says that the followers of Jesus, the early Christians, his immediate followers who were following him all along, after his death at the resurrection, began to worship him, to deify him, to consider him God. And then over time, ideas on how and why he is God and when he became God, whether he was God forever, developed. But what he is saying in essence is they worshipped him. He was divine. Early Christians worshipped Jesus.
Yeah. And keep in mind, why did they start worshiping him? Because they concluded that he rose from the dead. Why did they conclude that? According to Islam, because Allah did such a great job tricking everyone. So the reason Christians concluded that Jesus is God is because of Allah. Allah really, really messed that up and ended up creating the biggest false religion in history, according to our Muslim friends. But notice you got a couple of now. I wanted to point out that, because this applies to a lot of things. There are issues where Bart Ehrman is speaking, and he's speaking just straightforward factually, right? Mm-hmm. So when he talks about textual variants in the Bible, that's not his opinion. There are textual variants in Bible manuscripts. That's not an opinion that he's putting forward. When he talks about in the 2nd and 3rd century that there were these sort of different versions of Christianity, because as Christianity went out, there's no authority to crack down on people and make them all adhere to orthodoxy. So as Christianity spreads, it ends up combining with these different ideas in different areas, and you end up with different versions of Christianity. When he says that, it's not his opinion. You just had different versions of Christianity with some different beliefs in the 2nd, 3rd century. The Christianity that eventually wins out is the one that could take their, show that their teachings were the 1st century teachings, right? So you have those kinds of issues. Then you have other issues where it's Ehrman's interpretation, right? Because the question is, okay, here's the evidence we have, here's the data, and how do we get to this evidence, right? And so if you're Ehrman, Jesus is obviously not God. He's not born of a virgin. He didn't perform miracles, although, he was known as a miracle worker. So how do we actually get to a point where Jesus is being worshiped? And you need to explain, and you come up with an explanation. So we have here his explanation of how we got to the evidence. If you don't have a problem with God, don't have a problem with a virgin birth and things like that, then you don't really have a problem with the text where Jesus followers are worshiping him during the time of Jesus. If you don't believe in that, then you need a kind of explanation for how we got to those things. But notice, even if you go with Ehrman's explanation, even if you agree with him completely, hey, you say that does make sense of how we ultimately got to Christians believing that Jesus is God. During his life, they didn't believe it, but then they believed that he rose from the dead. This caused them to rethink things, and now he's risen from the dead. He's risen to be with God. So he's immortal. So he's divine being in some sense. He's what we would call a god or something like that. And then later Christian, no, he was always God. It wasn't that he's raised to that place. Now you've got something that fits together. Suppose you agree with Ehrman. That's how people came to believe that Jesus is God.
Yeah.
Islam is now false. Why are Muslims appealing to this? Islam is now false. Let me read you 2 quick verses, Muslims. Surah 3, verse 55 of the Quran. Behold, Allah said, so this is Allah talking to Jesus when Jesus is about to be taken away. Behold, Allah said, O Jesus, I will take thee and raise thee to myself and clear thee of the falsehoods of those who blaspheme. I will make those who follow you superior to those who reject faith to the day of resurrection. So wait a minute. Notice what he's doing here. Allah says, Jesus, the people who, you got 2 people. You got the people who believe in you and the people who don't believe in you. The people who believe in you, your disciples. So Jesus is worried about his disciples. He's about to be taken away. Allah says, Jesus, I'm taking you away, but those who followed you, I'm going to make them victorious until the day of resurrection. That makes no sense if they start worshiping him because Allah screwed up and made them think that he rose from the dead, right? So if Allah told Jesus, hey, I'm going to protect you. You want to read it here? So you have Sahih International. When Allah said, oh, Jesus, indeed, I will take you and raise you to myself and purify you from those who disbelieve and make those who follow you. And then they add in submission to Allah alone. But keep in mind, according to Muslims and their interpretation of Ehrman, his first disciples were Muslims, superior to those who disbelieve. How long? For another 2 months? For another 2 months until they start worshiping him? Until the day of resurrection. That's a long time. We're not even to the day of resurrection yet. So Jesus' followers are supposedly still protected from being led astray. Allah is protecting them, right? One more, 61:14. I'll go ahead. I'll pull it up, but you can pull it up too. 61:14. Surah 61, verse 14, ladies and gentlemen. Got the Sahih International there. O you who have believed, be supporters of Allah, as when Jesus, the son of Mary, said to the disciples, who are my supporters for Allah? The disciples said, we are supporters of Allah. So this is Jesus' disciples admitting that they're Muslims. And a faction of the children of Israel believed, and a faction disbelieved. So we supported those who believed against their enemy, and they became dominant. So now here's a question, Muslims. Which Christians, which followers of Jesus became dominant in Christianity? If you want to say there were Muslim followers of Jesus, they didn't become dominant, did they? We have no record of their even existing, right? except if you wanted to say theoretically. But notice, even theoretically, if you wanted to say the original followers of Jesus, who were Muslims and didn't believe that he died on the cross and rose from the dead and that he's Lord, they didn't believe that. Well, okay, if you want to believe them hypothetically, did they become dominant? Allah says he helped them, he aided them against their enemy, those who rejected Jesus, until they became dominant. Until they became, you have Pickthall right there, until they became uppermost. When did these original Muslim followers become uppermost over their enemies? You know, it's amazing. You can go to the Yusuf Ali edition of the Quran, the one that has commentary. Yusuf Ali says that this verse refers to Christians taking over the Roman Empire. Guess what? We know what the Christians who took over the Roman Empire believe. They believed in Jesus' death, resurrection, and deity. Those are the ones who became dominant. Those are the ones who became uppermost. So how, in the name of common sense, is Allah saying here that he's helping the true followers of Jesus? We know which followers of Jesus became uppermost. Allah says those are the followers of Jesus that he helped. Well, if there were any Muslim followers of Jesus, they definitely didn't become uppermost in any sense. They were crushed immediately, and then they ended up started worshiping Jesus because Allah deceived them.
You know what's very funny?
Amazing stuff, man. But
you know, there is a story in the Quran of the 7 sleepers, and the Quran doesn't specify their number. It says they were 5 or 7. They were 3 or 5 or 7, whatever. It says something like that, and it tells their story. And according to the Islamic account, according to the Quranic account, and the traditions, these were people who were persecuted in the Roman Empire when the Roman Empire was pagan and they believed in false gods. These people believed in the one true God. They were persecuted, so they fled to this cave and went to sleep there, and they then slept for 300 years by mistake or by a miracle. You know, they wanted to just go to sleep for the night, but they fell asleep and they woke up 300 years later. They wake up, they are hungry. One of them goes to the city to get food, and they go down to the city, and suddenly they realize, wait a minute, this place looks completely different. What happened here? In this place that we just fled from yesterday, people now believe in the one God. They now worship the one true God. What happened here? Something happened here. Then they realized that 300 years passed. They went to sleep during the pagan times of the Roman Empire. They slept for 300 years. Now they woke up, and in the Roman Empire, people now believe in the true God. People now follow the true religion, the right religion. So this is a miracle for those people to witness. And thereby, those 7 sleepers also begin finally openly expressing their true religion, and then they go to sleep forever. And this beautiful little story happens in the Roman Empire, where people believe in Jesus as God, in the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit. This story happens in a place where Christians believe in all these things that Islam says is very bad and blasphemous and disbelief. Why in the world does that happen? How does that make sense?
Yep. But hey, he said the Jesus original followers, like all Jews of the time, believed in one God. So yep, we're Muslims. Alhamdulillah, this is our vindication. Ehrman has proven our position.
You know what's funny? I wanted to point this out earlier, but in response to one of the questions, in response to the crucifixion question, Bart Ehrman said, and by the way, I'm not a Christian. I don't know if your followers know, I'm not a Christian. You know, it's so funny. He needs to point out that he is not a Christian. He's an atheist, because the answers that he gives are clearly not in alignment with Islam, and are clearly in agreement with Christianity, which is why he explicitly needs to point out, hey, by the way, guys, I'm not a Christian. I'm an atheist. You know, I don't have a stake in this fight between Christianity and Islam, but I have to point out that the Islamic narrative is false. So there you go.
And so, according to Ehrman, Jesus definitely crucified, not born of a virgin. Disciples who, if you want to just say any monotheist is a Christian, well, okay, you could. I mean, is a Muslim, well, great, you could say they're Muslims, but they ended up becoming worshippers of Jesus because, according to Islam, Allah tricked them into believing that Jesus rose from the dead. And this is the new Islamic apologetic, and it's brilliant. I love it.
Fantastic. Let me quickly read a few super chats that I might have missed out. Oliver Spiridon said, I am generous. Thank you so much, Oliver. Zagros Özkan said, David is to God what Princess Leia was to Jabba the Hutt. He's trying to make a joke, I guess, about you and God. But Zagros, please.
Oh, because they had Princess Leia as a slave girl.
Oh, yeah.
I'm a slave girl.
Yeah, you're a slave girl of God. Lisa H said, thank you for doing God's work, Secret Christian and Dizzle Dave. Thank you so much. I appreciate it. I openly said before that I'm a secret Christian early in their stream for those who came in later.
Literally had it on the screen.
Yeah, I earlier openly said that I'm a secret Christian, and I still openly say that I'm a secret Christian. Abraham Secoe said, in fact, Jesus was given no book as Islam claims, and this is another proof of how Islam is fake, because Jesus himself is the reason of the existence of the Gospels. Jesus did not have time to write anything. Yep. Thank you so much for that.
It's a little. I just wanted to quick comment here, because this is happening over and over and over again. There aren't always claims that you can go out and test, right? If some guy says, hey, I was in a cave and I got a revelation, not a lot of ways you can test that. When you start making claims that you can go out and test, so he's making all these claims about Jesus. When he's making these claims, when Muhammad's making these claims, all of a sudden, aha, now we can go and look into this. Aha, the Quran is saying Jesus had this book. Aha, now we can go and test this. Problem is, when we test it, Muhammad's either quoting some earlier source where he got it from that is reliable, or he's totally wrong, right? Yeah. And so it's in any area where he's not appealing, he's not just quoting some correct source. Other than that, he gets everything wrong. And so it's like, hey, here are these dozens of ways we can test you, and you always turn out to be wrong.
Yep. Gaming Checkpoint said, Ridwan, do you believe in a man named Jesus and that he really did miracles written in the New Testament? I do think that it is there is no reason to believe that Jesus did not exist. It's absurd. It's
take that, Jesus mythers.
Yeah, many things and many characters, many historical characters in history are assumed to be real, are assumed to have existed based on pieces of evidence that are much weaker and much lower in number than the evidence that we have for Jesus. There is no reason for me to say, oh no, Jesus absolutely didn't exist. Why would I do that? It's not plausible to do that. Do I believe that he performed miracles? I personally don't think so. I would have different explanations for miracles. But then again, I don't believe in the divine, which is not the point here. The point is that the Islamic accounts of Jesus and the Islamic retellings of the story of Jesus are not just, wrong in so far that they lie about who Jesus really was. They are just completely out of touch with the actual story of Jesus. And it's very easy for me to sit down and say, and to point out that these stories that Islam has about Jesus are fabrications, are based on later accounts, are based on legends, are based on misunderstandings of Christianity, and so on. And that is the point of me analyzing this. This is a big goal against Islam.
I just wanted to add, because I want this for future reference, because I just thought of it. You could put different views on a spectrum, and the further you get out towards the fringe, the sort of crazier it gets. So on one end of the spectrum, you have the Jesus myth, because notice all these views are trying to account for how we got what we have. We talked about this with Ehrman earlier, right? Ehrman's got some data, he's got some evidence that he's going with. Here are the sources we have. How do we get to those sources and those beliefs? And there are different ways you can get there. You come up with a hypothesis about how we got there, and then you see how well your hypothesis actually fits. On one sort of extreme, you have the Jesus mythers, right? Jesus never existed. So how do you get from a non-existent Jesus to all of these things in the first century, all of these people believing and following Jesus, Christianity spreading, you got the original disciples, you got the Apostle Paul, and so on. How do you get there? Well, they actually come up with stories. You can read the work of Richard Carrier or something like that to get this, but they come up with explanations for how you get all these people believing in Jesus from a non-existent Jesus, right? Then you've got then you've got some people who just think of Jesus like a hippie. So the Jesus seminars, Jesus is going around and he's telling parables, look at the lilies of the field and drawing some moral points. And he's basically a good moral teacher. Then you get to people like Ehrman, they're granting a little more about Jesus, like he believed that he's the Messiah and things like that. But they're still coming up with an explanation for how we eventually got towards belief in Jesus' deity and so on. Then you start getting into theistic positions, when, from a Christian perspective, hey, Jesus rose from the dead. This is a miraculous sign from God. And this, notice, once you accept Jesus rose from the dead, and this is vindication, you start looking at Jesus as like the central figure of history.
Yeah.
And then, of course, it makes sense that he's born of a virgin. Of course, it makes sense now that he performed all these miracles and so on.
Yeah.
But then you get on the other extreme, you get to this insane position called Islam, where Jesus is just a regular guy, but Allah is constantly sabotaging everything he does. And so notice, it's still, how do we get to the data that we have? How do we get to Christians worshiping Jesus and so on? How do you get to this from a Jesus who's just a prophet, for some reason, telling a bunch of people who already believe in God that they need to believe in God? How do you get to what we actually have? Well, what happened is Jesus went around preaching. He won a bunch of Muslim followers. Then Allah tricked everyone into thinking that he died on the cross, then tricked them into thinking that Jesus appeared to them. So now they believe in the resurrection. And this caused them to think that he's somehow divine. And then Allah helped and aided the followers who completely misunderstood Jesus and were worshiping him. Allah helped those believers in Jesus until they became uppermost, but didn't realize, oops, I got the wrong people, right? So notice you've got the spectrum of views. I would say the fringes are the craziest. So if you want a view, pick something in the middle, and a lot of it's going to come down to whether you have a problem with the supernatural or whether you don't. But I got the same views in the middle.
I was just visualizing the whole thing, by the way, the whole Allah raising Jesus to heaven and making making the true believers, Jesus' followers, superior. It's like, Allah is there and Allah is raising Jesus, and he's going, hey, Jesus, I will raise you and I will make your followers victorious and superior. And then he's like, come here, Jesus, let me raise you. And then he raises Jesus, and the followers, the believers see him, and they're like, whoa, I think he's God. He's God. He is God himself. Let us worship him. Let us worship him. And then Allah goes like, wait a minute, that's not what I was meaning to do.
Yeah,
and that is how Christianity came into existence.
Yeah. Notice we should make something on this, because we're actually onto something now as far as this being an insane fringe view. Notice what you're saying, right? Because you could put that together with some other things. If Allah just wants to preserve Jesus' message of the oneness of God and so on, why does he do all these things which caused people to believe in Christianity? So notice the virgin birth. Why is Jesus born of a virgin, according to Islam? No explanation. He just decided. Why does Jesus live the most miraculous life in history, according to Islam? No reason. Allah just decided to give him lots of miracles, unlike Muhammad, who couldn't perform any. Why is Jesus saved from someone wanting to execute him and raised to this exalted state? Allah's not going to let anyone kill Jesus. Other prophets, yeah, not Jesus. And then you get Muhammad, and Muhammad's poisoned by a Jewish woman whose family he slaughtered, right? But Allah didn't rescue him. So
maybe it's because Jesus had a very cool name. I mean, would you rather make Jesus a cool guy, or would you rather make someone whose name is Muhammad the cool guy?
Yeah, but notice, Allah does all this work to convince everyone that Jesus is radically different from everyone else, including every other prophet.
Yeah.
And this is all some sort of effort to prove that Jesus is just a regular guy, when everyone misinterprets it all and concludes that Jesus is Lord. This is Allah's blunder, Allah's biggest blunder.
And
Muhammad.
How could these stupid followers of Jesus, these Christians, they come up with the dumb idea that Jesus is somehow very, very special and above creation, above everything else?
Allah did.
When Allah makes everything so special for Jesus. I mean, it's of course completely normal for Allah to get angry at the Christians, right? I mean, it makes complete sense. Yeah, I agree.
Hey,
okay.
Allah on Judgment Day, Allah is going to be like, Christians, why did you believe me when I tricked you, and not later when I told you the truth that contradicted the earlier lie I told you? how could you not trust me later after I lied to you?
Yeah.
Like, what is this, man? Once you have an omnipotent deceiver as the foundation of your theology, wowzers.
Yeah, absolutely. What about the idea of the Son of God? Did they understand him to be the Son of God, not only in the sense of a great guy, but also in in a spiritual, religious way, the way Christians later understood him? Was that something that was there from the beginning?
I think it was there from the beginning, but they meant something different by it. In Jewish circles, Son of God is used in the Old Testament, in the Hebrew Bible. Son of God is used for various beings. It can be used for angels, for example, but it can also be used for humans. The king of Israel was known as the Son of God. And the logic of it was that God has a kind of a representative on earth through whom he channels his will. And this person would be a human, could be a human, but it was the one who was in a particularly close relationship with God, through whom God mediated his will. And so Jesus would have been seen as the Son of God in that sense. And he might have even talked about himself as the Son of God in that sense. Later, that came to mean that in some sense he himself was divine, that he was God. And that's meaning that carried on later. But early on, I don't think they meant it that way.
Hey, it's me again. Oh yeah, that's me again. So one thing that's very funny that I want to point out is now I forgot it because of me jumping in. Oh yeah, one quick distinction that I want to make. So he says that they knew him as the Son of God, but they probably meant something different. That is what he says, and I would say, in all honesty, I would possibly agree with him in a way when I read the Gospels or the earliest accounts about Jesus. The issue is compare that with the Islamic, the Quranic account about Jews in Quran chapter 9 verse 30, where it says, and the Christians say the Messiah is the son of Allah, and the Jews say Ezra is the son of Allah, and that is what they adopted from those who believed before them. May Allah destroy them. How deluded are they? We have no records of Jews ever considering Ezra to be the son of God. There is no such thing. We could probably have records of them referring to him as a son of God in a sense that he is very special. They could also refer to David or to others in that sense as very special, as very, very close to God. The issue is, if we want to accept that that is the case, and if Muslims want to accept that that is the case, then why exactly would the Islamic God, Allah, blame the Jews for saying Ezra is the son of Allah, and would threaten them and would send them to hell for that? Why exactly would that happen? Obviously, you see that is a problematic thing to say.
Mm-hmm. There are
You're
multiple
quiet.
problems here.
You're quiet. Okay, you're fine now.
There are multiple problems here. Notice, if any Muslim agrees right there, no one's a son of God in any sense, according to Islam, right? Not even in a figurative sense, So if Ehrman is right here, so you could grant everything Ehrman said, and as I pointed out before, there are things where Ehrman is speaking factually. This is the way things are, and he's right. It's that's what the evidence is. There are other times when he's giving his interpretation, like how we got to the evidence. This is one of those areas where he's giving his interpretation, how we actually got to the evidence, and you put together a kind of story. Well, if you're starting out with Jesus not being God, or the real, the Son of God, how do you get to claims where Jesus is the divine Son of God? And so it's generally you look for some sort of evolutionary account where things change over time. So that's one issue. But notice, even if he's right, if he's correct, and Jesus is the Son of God in the sense of someone who has this relationship with God, that God is channeling his will through this person and so on, according to Islam, no one should ever be called the Son of God, and not even in a figurative sense. But notice, in Old Testament and New Testament, there are people who are called Son of God, Old Testament and New Testament. Right now, the question is, if Jesus is the Son of God, as Christians believe, well, you've got other people who are called sons of God, and so you have to look at the meaning in context. The reason I would disagree with Ehrman here is you just have too many passages where and passages that go back to a very early stage where Jesus sounds like he's thinking of more than just being a mere human being. I'll give you an example here. So we'll go to, let's see. All right, so this is Matthew chapter 11, where Jesus says in verse 27, all things have been handed over to me by my Father, and no one knows the Son except the Father, and no one knows the Father except the Son, and anyone to whom the Son chooses to reveal him. This is Matthew, but it's also Luke, which means it's classified as Q, sayings, a collection of sayings, either oral or written, that predates Matthew and Luke. It's considered very early. So this is an early reference where Jesus is claiming this absolutely unique relationship with the Father. You've got the Father and the Son. No one knows the Son except the Father. No one knows the Father except the Son. And you can't know the Father unless Jesus reveals him to you. Doesn't sound like he's just, when he calls himself the Son in these kinds of contexts, it doesn't sound like he's just referring to himself as another human being. So I would disagree with that. But here's the thing. So Ehrman has his view of how we got to things. Christians have their view of how we got the evidence here. Whoever's right, Islam is wrong. Right? Whoever's right. So whether it's just a figurative title or whether it's a literal title, Jesus didn't have either title according to Islam. And so, wait a minute. Islam is wrong according to me. Islam is wrong according to Bart Ehrman. Muslims, stop quoting Bart Ehrman. It's an embarrassment to you.
Yeah. I quickly want to bring this up here. Quran chapter 9, verse 30, the Jews say Ezra is the son of Allah, and the Christians say the Messiah is the son of Allah. That is their statement. From their mouths, they imitate the saying of those who disbelieved before them. May Allah destroy them. How are they deluded? We still need to go to a Jewish gathering and ask people why they keep saying Ezra is the son of Allah. We still need to do that.
One more. One more passage. So this is from the book of Matthew, although it's also in Mark and Luke. Matthew chapter 22, starting at verse 41. What you have is people keep trying to trap Jesus in his words in order to set some people against him and so on. But Jesus all of a sudden asks a question, and he's talking to the religious leaders. And he says, now, while the Pharisees were gathered together, Jesus asked them a question, saying, what do you think about the Christ? Whose son is he? They said to him, the son of David. He said to them, how is it then that David in the Spirit calls him Lord, saying, quote from David, the Lord said to my Lord, sit at my right hand until I put your enemies under your feet. If then David calls him Lord, how is he his son? And no one was able to answer him a word, nor from that day did anyone dare to ask him more questions. So this is an example of a passage where it doesn't sound like Jesus is saying that he's a son in the sense of being a king of Israel or something like that, right? Because look at what he's saying here. He's saying, who's the Christ? Whose son is he? They say the son of David, descendant of David. He said to them, then how does David call him Lord? Saying the Lord said to my Lord. So this is considered a messianic psalm. And the Lord there's Yahweh said to my Lord, sit at my right hand until I put your enemies under your feet. So you have Yahweh speaking to someone that David calls Lord. That Lord is the Messiah. So Jesus is saying, hey, you guys are calling the Messiah the son of David, but David calls the Messiah his Lord. So how is he really the son of David? If son of God, so what he's saying is that, wait, this is the son of God, not just the son of David. Here it looks like he's saying, hey, you guys have this idea of the Messiah. The Messiah is bigger than you're aware of. He's something more than the merely human king that you're aware of. But notice this is in Mark, this is in Matthew, this is in Luke. I've never seen any reason not to treat this story as authentic.
Yep.
Again, here's an area where I would disagree. I think it has some strong indications that Jesus considered himself the Son of God. Which, no, keep in mind, you don't have to you wouldn't have to believe in God and believe a Christian in order to believe that, right? You could say,
Yeah.
I mean, if you say Jesus is the Messiah, you don't, I mean, if you say Jesus believed that he was the Messiah, you wouldn't have to believe that he's actually the Messiah. You'd say he was mistaken. He thought of himself like that and he was wrong. Well, similarly, you could say Jesus thought of himself as some sort of exalted divine son who was the Messiah, and you could say he was just wrong.
I mean, to me, it's absolutely plausible that Jesus thought of himself as God or as Son of God. But then again, who am I? So there's a thing.
Yeah, and again, the cool part is Ehrman agrees that Jesus was considered Son of God in some sense, and so Islam is false, no matter what.
No matter what, Islam is false.
Wrong, Muhammad.
As we were just talking about this whole stuff, I just had a moment and I was thinking to myself, what am I doing? You know, why do I have a giant channel in which I talk about religion? It's like, how did that happen? How did that come into existence?
You're a secret Christian.
I don't know. Maybe I should be doing something else here. I'm thinking right now of turning this channel into a gaming channel or something. I will see. I will think about that. Let me know, everybody.
AP gaming, apostate gaming.
Apostate gaming, yeah. Okay. Is there any different gospel that is, in your opinion, or according to your findings, more authentic than the recognized gospels that we have within the New Testament?
No, I don't think so. I think that the four we have are the oldest ones that we have. There were some that had been written earlier that we don't have anymore, but these four are the four oldest. And the first three in particular, Matthew, Mark, and Luke, have a good deal of historical material in them. John also has some, but it's a very different kind of gospel. The later gospels tend to be, for one thing, they're much later, and they're more highly legendary. So I don't think that there are any other gospels that give us much historical information that's not already in the New Testament.
What about Paul? Do you want to include the next question? The next question is about Paul. I don't know if there's much to add here. We basically addressed much of this. Paul, the authenticity of Paul's texts, some of which, as far as I understand it, precede the earliest gospel that we have. How authentic are the accounts of Paul?
So the New Testament has 27 books altogether, and 13 of them claim to be written by Paul. So they're called the Pauline epistles. But of those 13, 6 of them are now doubted by scholars. Scholars think that 6 of them actually weren't written by Paul, but by people claiming to be Paul later. And I think that judgment is right. The other 7 are sometimes called the undisputed Pauline letters. They include many of the longest letters, and I think that they do go back to Paul. And in some places, Paul talks about things that Jesus said and did during his life. Paul says a lot about Jesus being crucified and being raised from the dead, and so that's a lot of Paul. But he does occasionally mention something Jesus said or did, and that is older information than we get in the Gospels, because these letters were written before the Gospels.
Mm-hmm. All right.
Just one quick comment on that, since he's talking about Paul, and this ties into something earlier where it's one of the things that you have to account to. So you have to account for how people started calling Jesus God. And Ehrman seemed to be claiming, well, they thought of Jesus as just, an immortal at first, and then, later people came on. But in Philippians, which is he referred to the undisputed letters of Paul. Philippians is one of the 7 there. You have this passage where Paul records an early Christian hymn, a song that they would gather together and sing. So Paul records an early Christian song. So this is very early. This is well within the lifetimes of Jesus' original followers. Paul knew the original followers. He went up to Jerusalem repeatedly to interact with the original followers. And if he were off on something theologically, seems like he would have been corrected. But Paul says in Philippians chapter 2, verse 5, have this mind among yourselves, which is yours in Christ Jesus, who, though he was in the form of God, so you have like NIV will say in very nature God, and you have here he's in the form of God, who, though he was in the form of God, did not count equality with God a thing to be grasped, but emptied himself by taking the form of a servant, being born in the likeness of men. And being found in human form, he humbled himself by becoming obedient to the point of death, or even death on a cross. Therefore, God has highly exalted him and bestowed on him the name that is above every name, so that at the name of Jesus, every knee should bow in heaven and on earth and under the earth, and every tongue confess that Jesus Christ is Lord, to the glory of God the Father. So there you have Paul recording an early Christian hymn song, and it's Jesus is in the form of God, but he doesn't consider that something to be grasped. He empties himself, takes on the nature of a human. So it's not a human who is eventually raised to a divine status. It's someone who lowers himself to humanity, then eventually gets raised back up. You also have the distinction between the Father and the Son there. And again, you have this very early in Christian history. And so
Which text was that you just read?
that was Philippians chapter 2,
Philippians. Okay.
starting at verse 5.
Okay.
And so, yeah, it's put it this way. I think it's a bit
Which
harder.
is part of the undisputed Pauline epistles. Yeah.
Yes, and so basically, I think it's a bit harder to get the view of Jesus as divine and as someone who entered creation and then was raised back up is really, really early. So if you want to say how they got to it really early, which you could do, you could still do as Ehrman. You could just say the resurrection really just blew their minds, and they concluded that he's divine. But yeah.
Yep. Fantastic. It was your idea. We talked about this briefly before, but that the gospel in its original setting and according to the ideas of the earliest followers of Jesus would not be in alignment with the Islamic understanding of religion, right? I mean,
Well, I mean, to some extent it is. I mean, they believe that there's one God and that he has prophets and that the Old Testament's a sacred book and, the New Testament's important, but the earliest they didn't have a New Testament, obviously, but they would not have subscribed to many of the teachings of Islam because the teachings hadn't been invented yet. It's hundreds of years later that they came into being.
This is a very Islamophobic comment that Bart Ehrman made.
Yeah, but they believed in one God. They believed in one God, so they were Muslims.
Yeah. In one God. And what he means by one God is in one God. He's not going into the detail of it. Yeah. Christians believe in one God. Not according to Muslims, though. That's the problem. Well. And were the Christians throughout the history of Christianity over the next 7 centuries especially vastly consistent with mainline Christian ideas, such as that Jesus is somehow the Son of God, that he's somehow divine, and all these things? That this was a dominant, vast idea among Christians, right?
So a lot of my books deal with this issue, and one of the things that I argue at length is that in the earliest centuries, in say the 2nd century, the 3rd century, so I'm talking like 100, 200 years after Jesus, there was a lot of diversity within early Christianity. There were various groups of people who claimed to be followers of Jesus that had different books from the ones that got into the New Testament. They claimed these books were written by apostles, and they supported views that there were lots of controversial views floating around. There are Christians who said that there are 2 separate gods. Some Christians said there are 12 gods. Some said there were 36 gods. Some people said Jesus wasn't really a human being, but he was fully God. Others said he's human, but he wasn't God. So there are all sorts of views about all sorts of things in the 2nd and 3rd centuries. Most of those views got hammered out by the beginning of the 4th century when the Emperor Constantine had become a Christian. And from the 4th century to the 7th century, there's still lots of diversity, but the diversity has to do with things that most people would consider to be more minor. There were big debates, like really going at it debates. But, they agree, everybody agreed. Jesus is God. He was also human. There's a Trinity. They agree with these basic things.
Yeah, they very much just disagreed on how to explain these things together and had
well, if Jesus is God and he's man, how does it work? Is he 50% of each? Is he 100% of each? The view that came out, by the way, is that he's 100% God and 100% man at the same time. Okay. Wow.
Yeah, I love his reactions to things, but
yeah, he's hilarious. He seems like a fun guy to watch a football game or something with. On that last point, I'm confused because I would think that Ehrman, who's spent a lot of time studying a lot of this, would not find the 100% confusing. The way, I understand when someone first hears he's 100% God, 100% man, they go, wait, what the heck? That's 200%. All that means is if you take a gallon of milk and a gallon of orange juice and you mix them together, you get something that's not orange juice and it's not milk. Mm-hmm. It's a mixture. It's a mixture, right? It's neither one anymore, right? It's some sort of in-between mixture, right? If you take a gallon of milk and a gallon of orange juice and sort of just, attach them to one another without mixing them, you still have something that is 100% milk and something that is 100% orange juice, right? So when we're talking about the nature of Jesus, he's right. He's right. It's, hey, if you're saying Jesus is God and he has a human nature, how are you going to explain this? Are you explaining it? And so the conclusion of the debates was, it's not a mixture. It's not now he's half God and half man. It's he has a fully divine nature and he has a fully human nature. He's an actual human being, and those natures were together in Jesus. So anyway, I was confused by him not getting that.
No, it's funny. The thing is, I'm asking these questions to him, and to most of the questions, I already know the answer. I looked into the answers long ago. I studied the answers, and I'm asking them deliberately because I'm annoyed by the fact that Muslims keep coming with Bart Ehrman, and nobody is asking him these very specific questions that are pretty bad for Islam. If they are answered properly by somebody like Bart Ehrman. If we have the fact that Christians throughout history, from the very early moment of Christianity, throughout history, vastly agreed that Jesus is God and the Son of God, or God and or the Son of God in a sense, then that is simply pretty bad for Islam, because Islam teaches us this whole idea that Christians were righteous at some point, that they were righteous until Muhammad came and they rejected Muhammad, that Christians before Muhammad were rightly guided and that they have nothing to fear and all that. But when you look at the actual history of Christianity, you see that the vast majority of Christians until the rise of Islam, and much later, still today, believe in these ideas. They worship Jesus. They only explain the whole issue differently. They explain the human nature and the divine nature of Jesus differently. His relationship to God, his part of the Trinity, his pre-existence, or whether he was made God, and all that. They argue about these things. They disagreed about these things, but they agree with what Islam condemns, which is that Jesus is God and or Son of God. Very clear.
Yeah, and just keep in mind what we talked about earlier for anyone who's tuning in late. What Ehrman just talked about there was the Christianity that won, saying that they have some minor disagreements, but they all believe that Jesus is Lord, that Jesus died on the cross, that Jesus rose from the dead. Keep in mind, Allah said that he was going to help the true followers of Jesus until they became uppermost. Which followers of Jesus became uppermost? The ones who preached his death, resurrection, and deity. You can, again, everyone go to the commentary of Yusuf Ali on Surah 61, verse 14 of the Quran. It's the Quran that most Muslim organizations would hand you if you asked for a copy of the Quran. Yusuf Ali basically says the only way that makes sense of this is referring to Christians taking over the Roman Empire. So similar to what Ehrman is saying, this is when you've got Christianity widespread. They're in widespread agreement and so on. Guess what? They preach Jesus' death, resurrection, and deity. So you got two possibilities. Either Allah helped the right ones, in which case Islam is false because Allah helped people who believed in Jesus' death, resurrection, and deity, and they were right, or he helped the wrong ones, in which case it was wrong. It was wrong when he talked to Jesus. And so if he was wrong, saying he was going to help the true followers of Jesus, did he know he was wrong? In which case he's a liar and he's evil, or was he just ignorant? He tried, oops, I helped the wrong people. Which one is the point is, Muslims, there's no way to make sense of this from an Islamic perspective. That would be the takeaway, right? There's no way to make sense of the history of Christianity, of the New Testament, of the Old Testament, of the claims of Bart Ehrman. You can't make sense of any of that. Take any position you want. Theological, theist,
I think you're just being
whatever.
too judgmental.
It just doesn't make sense.
You're just being too judgmental. You're being too harsh on Allah. Allah tried. He tried his best. He said he would protect those.
He tried.
He would protect those. He would make those superior who are the true believers over those who are the disbelievers. He tried. He wanted to do it. It didn't work, but he tried,
hey,
David. Why do you judge him?
We should get together and make some skits, maybe some claymation or something like that, where Allah is sitting there. I've got my plan. I'm going to go help the true followers. First, I'm going to trick people into believing that Jesus died. I've got some reason for that. Doesn't make any sense, but I'm going to do that. Now they all think that Jesus died. Huh. I guess I should let Jesus appear to them so that they know he's not really dead. And then they'll all continue believing in the teachings of Jesus. Oops, they believe he rose from the dead. Darn it. Now what am I going to do? Oh, no. Now they're concluding, based on these Old Testament passages, that Jesus is Lord. What am I going to do here? Right? I mean, you could just, let me help them anyway. Let me help them take over the Roman Empire. Right? I mean, it's like one, you have to believe that Allah, I mean, if you're a Muslim and you take this seriously and you're trying to get to the evidence we actually have, given the claims that Allah makes, you have to believe that he is the Inspector Clouseau of the universe. I mean, it's just, wow.
Absolutely. I agree. Yeah. Okay. Everybody, while you're here, don't forget to like the stream and to support the stream. And since I am doing my best in pretending to be an atheist while I'm actually a secret Christian, and why would I be doing that? I'm doing that for money, of course. And while I'm doing that in the best way possible, please don't forget to also support the channel, to make super chats, to support the channel on in form of different donations and all that. I am doing my best. Please help me out, guys. Thank you. Let's continue with the video here. Two more questions. One of them is the idea that Jesus was merely a prophet who came in his time and who just spread a message of prophesying or informing the people about the coming of a more significant guy like Muhammad in the future. Is this a plausible idea?
It's plausible up until the time that you say that he's predicting somebody yet to come. I think that Jesus thought that he was the last. I think he was a prophet. In the sense that he believed that he was speaking God's word. And I believe he thought he was the last prophet. I think he thought that he was the Messiah who was to come. And that in his view, I don't think Jesus expected to get crucified. I think just the opposite. I think Jesus expected God to send his kingdom to earth. And when the kingdom came to earth, he was going to make Jesus the Messiah. And Jesus would be the ruler of this future kingdom. So I have to argue. It takes a lot of argument to show that that's what was going on, but I do that in a couple of my books. I definitely do not think that Jesus was predicting Muhammad or anyone else, that he thought that he was it.
So insofar, I would think that incorporating Jesus into Islam was a very big miscalculation on the Islamic part. But
well, calculation, it worked rather well. That's fine, but I don't think.
I found that hilarious. So two things here. One thing, obviously, Bart Ehrman disagrees with Christianity and criticizes Christianity. Mm-hmm. Yes, but the second thing. How in the world could you possibly take his answer and think that his conclusions are in support of the Islamic point of view? It clearly doesn't work.
He knows the New Testament really, really well. He knows the manuscripts really, really well. He knows the textual variants really, really well. And it just seems to be in the minds of Muslims. I mean, one, they'll try to quote passages which clearly aren't referring to Muhammad, but it seems to be in the back of their minds as well. There are these other manuscripts out there and these other Bibles, and maybe they talk about Muhammad and so on. Well, here you have Ehrman. I mean, would have been very easy to say, well, you could say, because notice he's very generous. He seems to very often try to say, well, in the sense of this, you could be right. So, yeah, you're claiming that Jesus followers were Muslims. You know, if you're thinking they're monotheists or something, maybe. He's trying to be very reasonable. And here it's just no. There's nothing to indicate that Jesus was talking about someone else. So, I mean, I do find it interesting that Ehrman, so he thinks that Jesus believed he was the Messiah. And he's like, he's last. He's like the final thing, which doesn't make sense if Muhammad's coming later. Let me just give an example why that is. I'll read through it real quick, and then we can go on, or you can add your comments. But so this is Mark chapter 12, and I think this would be. You have a bunch of passages like this, a bunch of stories, a bunch of sayings of Jesus, where he's sort of the big finale. So Matthew chapter 12, I'll just start at the beginning. And he began to speak to them in parables. These are one of Jesus' stories, which he's using to get a message across. A man planted a vineyard. So the man here in the parable is God. I'm not saying God is a man here. This is the parables are meant to illustrate something in language that people could understand because they're familiar with all this stuff. And then you're making, a moral point or a theological point. So a man planted a vineyard and put a fence around it and dug a pit for the winepress and built a tower and leased it to tenants and went into another country. When the season came, he sent a servant to the tenants to get from them some of the fruit of the vineyard. And they took him and beat him and sent him away empty-handed. Again, he sent to them another servant, and they struck him on the head and treated him shamefully. And he sent another, and him they killed. And so with many others, some they beat and some they killed. He had still one other, a beloved son. Finally, he sent him to them, saying, they will respect my son. But those tenants said to one another, this is the heir. Come, let us kill him, and the inheritance will be ours. And they took him and killed him and threw him out of the vineyard. What will the owner of the vineyard do? He will come and destroy the tenants and give the vineyard to others. Have you not read the scripture? The stone that the builders rejected has become the cornerstone. This was the Lord's doing, and it is marvelous in our eyes. So Jesus is trying to tell a story about him approaching his listeners. And he says, he gives them a story. Okay, there's a guy. He puts together a vineyard and he leases it out to people. And then he sends some people to collect the money. These are referring to the prophets. He's sending prophets to them. And instead of believing the prophets, they beat them, they kill some of them, and so on. And so finally he says, all right, enough of the prophets. I'm sending my son. I'm sending my son. And so notice there, according to the story, the son is like the last thing. It's not, oh, the son didn't work. Let me send another prophet, right? It's the son is the sort of finale of the story. Notice this is in Mark. So this is our earliest gospel. Mm-hmm. And again, you have these kinds of things over and over again. So it looks like Ehrman is taking these seriously as going back to something that Jesus taught. Like he sees all the prophets, and then it gets to him, and he's the main guy.
Yeah, he's the final.
And that doesn't fit with Islam, ladies and gentlemen. So stop.
Not at all. That is completely in contradiction with Islam. Entirely in contradiction with Islam. It is entirely in contradiction with core Islamic beliefs, with what the Quran says. It doesn't work. It doesn't work. Oliver Spiridon made a super chat and said, "Dear AP, I like the way you talk, the way you respect people. Remember, when people die, the world won't remember them of their religion or atheism. The people will just say this man was good." Mm-hmm. Thank you so much. I appreciate it.
I just want you don't respect Ali Dawah. You say mean things about him, man. So I just wanted to clarify that. AP respects a lot of people, maybe most people, but he's very disrespectful towards certain people. So just clarify.
Yeah. Right. Well, the thing is, I have to clarify, I really respect a lot of people. I really like people. I really forgive people and really give them the benefit of the doubt. And even after having long fights with Mohammed Hijab in the past, I said in a video or in a live stream that I don't hate him. I don't blame him. I think he simply does what he is driven to, what he thinks is right, and what he thinks is justified in his own belief and in his ridiculous impulses. The thing is, sometimes you just get to a stage, like with Ali Dawah, that guy. I mean, it's very hard for me to be charitable with somebody like Ali Dawah. I try really hard to be good. I try really hard to be forgiving. I try very, very hard to be patient. But then this guy comes. Yesterday, he published a video in which he talks about this guy who was charged for pedophilia or something. In that video, he talks about out of nowhere, he mentions Douglas Murray. Then he mentions you, and he says that Douglas Murray, people like Douglas Murray and David Wood, they are the people who fit the profile of a pedophile. That's what he says about you. Out of nowhere.
Notice. Notice. There is no world where I fit the profile. I don't know about Douglas Murray. I think, isn't he gay or something? Maybe he's saying something about that.
Yeah.
D Wood likes boobies, but anyway, the point here is you can lay out the characteristics of pedophiles. There isn't. I can't imagine one that I would. I like boobies too much, man. But here's what's amazing. If you look at why Ali Dawah is doing that, why he would just say something. Ha ha! I'm going to say he fits the profile of a pedophile. It's because, think about this. His prophet had sex with a prepubescent girl. Ali Dawah said that he would tell his 9-year-old daughter that if she's ready, then she could be married.
Yeah.
But then they get made fun of for that. And I made an entire video called Ali G Dawah. Ali G Dawah, because Ali G, the famous Sacha Baron Cohen character, was saying these ridiculous lines like, "If there's fluff on the muff, then she's old enough." He was talking about voting, right? But it sounded like he's talking. It sounded like he's talking about sex. But the guy acts just like Ali Dawa. Right? So I was calling it Ali G Dawa and showing how he would actually, Ali Dawa would actually agree with those things, and so on and so. But notice the tendency, because they do the same thing with Jesus, they do the same thing with other prophets. It's, hey, they're making fun of Muhammad for this, so therefore let's make up something and attack Jesus, whom we respect, in his mother Mary, and let's say she was a prepubescent girl. Let's say Rebecca was 3 years old. Total lie. Even, wait a minute, you're saying Isaac, a prophet, had sex with a 3-year-old girl. Why? Because your prophet had sex with a 9-year-old, and you're trying to make it look like Isaac is worse than your prophet. But you respect the prophets. And so there's just this tendency. We've talked about the tendency to cherry pick, to twist things in order to bring them, make them fit Islam. But then there's this other tendency of, hey, there are all these things you guys keep making fun of our prophet about. And so let's just lie about you guys in response. You're telling the truth about our prophet. So in response, we're going to lie about you and your religion and so on. And it's just seriously.
Yeah, what he did in the video about me is, I keep watching the video. I keep watching it because I feel like, what is this guy talking about? He's just making up these things now. And then he comes to me. He talks about me. First off, he lies. He says that I rejected a face-to-face debate with him, which is not true. I explicitly said to him, hey, I don't want to have a face-to-face debate, but if you really want it, come here and we will have it. But what I will not accept is having a live crowd of your audience in front of me, because I don't think, I just don't want to do this. I don't want to do that. It is completely necessary. If you are the one challenging me, come here, let's do this. Let's stream it to a live audience. Let everyone watch it. And he goes out there, lies about me. And what he then says is that I told him before that I would have sex, I would consider having sex with my children, with my son or my daughter, and I would be okay with others having sex with their family members as long as they use protection. That's what he said in his video about me. I know, I'm sorry, this is very very explicit, very brutal, but this is what he says about me in the video. And
keep in mind, these are mainstream popular Muslim apologists. It's not some fringe weirdo, right? You could go on and find a Christian or an atheist really weird person saying horrible things, saying things like that about people. That person would not become popular. That person wouldn't become popular. You go around saying those things as a Muslim apologist, and suddenly you become the hero, and it makes you more and more popular. The more you lie, the more you deceive, the more you heap completely false insults on people, the more popular you become. And once again, guys, does the true religion, does the true God, does the true prophet need this? I mean, I have to say, I think
it would be one thing if he said that I would probably do these things, or it would be one thing if he said, he's the guy who would do such a thing. I would think, wow, that's horrible, man. That's disgusting, man. But he says, I told him I would do these things, which is, it never happened. There is no such thing. It never happened. There's no evidence to it.
Well, your word against his. He's one of the biggest liars on the planet, which is why he's so popular.
It's ridiculous, man. It's very hard for me to be charitable with somebody like him. It's just very, very hard.
I briefly mentioned Ali Dawa as someone someone you're not respectful towards, and then we had like this this tirade. It is, look, man, I really think we're watching these guys and they're basically drowning. They're not used to people looking up the facts and exposing them as liars and so on. They're drowning. They know people are leaving Islam left and right, and they're flailing about like someone who's drowning and trying to just cling to anything to try and help them. And it's they're getting desperate, but man, it's fun to watch.
It is. Yeah, it is. It is. All right, we're coming to the final part of. There's actually not much here that can be said, but
it's historically accurate.
Yeah. Okay. That's sufficient. Finally, what do you think about the comparison between Muhammad as a figure? I don't know how much you are familiar, but Muhammad as a religious historical figure and Jesus as a historical figure. Do you think they are similar, comparable, different? What is your view on this in general?
In terms of their messages, you mean, or in terms of whether they historically or who we think they were, or what?
In terms of their messages, and as far as we have information on them, on how
Yeah.
they were.
Well, I'm not a scholar of Islam, and so I'm not really equipped to say whether the sources on Muhammad can be considered reliable from a critical point of view. Of course, they are from a Muslim religious point of view. They're completely reliable, and that can be said about Jesus too. From a conservative Christian point of view, the information on Jesus is completely reliable. What would a hardcore historian who doesn't have any religious commitment one way or the other say about Muhammad? The way I understand it is that there are controversies among historians about how accurate our sources are about Muhammad, but I'm not equipped to give you the details. With Jesus, I'm equipped to give you the details that we do have historical information, but a lot of legendary material as well. In terms of their messages, I think it's really important to understand that Jesus and Muhammad are living in very different times and places. They have different assumptions about the world, different presuppositions. Jesus is a first century apocalyptic Jew. And so, he has a very different message from anybody living hundreds of years later, I think, whatever the person's religion, including Christians living hundreds of years later. I mean, Christians contemporary with Muhammad have a very different view of Jesus from the one that historians today would have.
Thank you so much for that. Yeah, so there was not much on his part to add to that question. In all honesty, that was not a question that I prepared beforehand. I just wanted to add that at the end. But what he basically said is there's little that we can say about it. Different environments, different standards, and so on. So yeah.
Yeah. So we're stuck with. We're all stuck with the evidence, right? We all have that. We all have the sources that exist and so on. And the question is how we got that information. And you have a Christian perspective, you have a critical atheistic perspective of someone who actually, studies the sources. You can always have dumb perspectives of people who don't study, but Ehrman, he studies and stuff. So, you should listen to what he's saying and see if it really accounts for the data.
Yeah.
The point is, whoever's right, Islam is wrong. Whoever's right, Islam just has to be wrong. And Islam has the position that can't possibly be reconciled with the evidence we have. Like Jesus mythers, right? Jesus mythers. I think it's a ridiculous position. But you can, by a stretch of the imagination, come up with a story, I think a bad one, about how you started off with no Jesus and then you got to a bunch of people believing in Jesus. I think you could come up with a story. I don't think it's believable. But when you're dealing with Islam, you're dealing with a story that is completely incoherent. It doesn't fit no matter what. It doesn't make sense that God is sending Jesus, promising Jesus that he's going to protect his followers until the day of resurrection, then deceives those followers, convinces them to worship Jesus as Lord, then helps those followers until they become uppermost, then sends Muhammad to rebuke and kill those guys who believed in the lie that he sent. You cannot make sense of this, right? It is completely incoherent. And so you have a bunch of positions, theistic and non-theistic, which do a better or worse job of accounting for evidence, but they're not completely impossible positions, right? When you get to it, they're just various degrees of, how well they account for the evidence that we have. And then you have Islam, which is the one position that can't possibly be true. There's no way to make sense of it. And Muslims, if you don't believe me, tell your scholars to come on and we'll just iron this out. Like I want a coherent picture that actually fits the evidence we have and it fits what the Muslim sources say. So show me, given them what the Muslim sources say, how we got to the evidence we have. You can't do it because it's impossible. You can't, what your prophet said, he shot himself right in the foot, because that's what happens when you appeal to Jesus and completely contradict him, right? You appeal to his followers and you completely contradict them. It just doesn't work out.
True. All right, that's fantastic. Thank you so much, David, for joining and for doing the whole thing that you did. Let me quickly read the super chats that we have here before I forget them. I know you have a lot of time. Okay, Mango Tea made a super chat and said, "Why is it that Islam makes you angry, lazy, and ignorant? Many Muslims have these traits." Well, I wouldn't say that. I would never say something like that. I would say though that Islam made me angry back in the day. It also made me ignorant, and maybe it made me lazy. It's just, I don't know. It has certain aspects. It teaches you to be hostile. It is very authoritarian, and if you are under constant pressure, under constant authoritarianism, you will likely become very angry and very hostile. And if your religion teaches you that you should only believe in this one thing and nothing else, that will make you ignorant. And that, I would say, is an explanation to that.
I would say that Islam actually, I mean, you can see why in Islam it would lead to things like that, right? Because you're the best of peoples, other people are the worst of creatures, and yet they very frequently turn out to be much more powerful than you. And you get this sort of rage building up. Why are
Why
all
is this
these
happening?
why are all these people and then these other people, because they're more powerful than you, they can insist on rules where they're allowed to criticize your prophet and point out the obvious lies of your scholars and apologists. And that just
How can they do
enrages
that?
them, enrages them. What we can say is, even though Islam would cause this, we can be thankful that so many Muslims in the world live far better lives than what their prophet called them to. Right, so that's why you have Muslims who are some of the most friendly people in the world. They're not falling for it.
Yeah, Adolf Hitler made a chat here and said, "I converted to Islam because of apostate prophet." Zagros Eskan said,
Alhamdulillah, another convert to Islam. This is because they saw that it was true from Bart Ehrman.
Zagros Eskan made a super chat and said, "AP, you know the answer, my man." I know the answer, but I don't want to ask David Wood controversial questions here.
Yeah.
We're not going to do that. Alex Tremor Del Norte said, Bible says he who denies Jesus shall be denied by him. That's not how a secret a Christian can be. People would avoid it to the point of martyrdom, just saying. Yeah, but hey, there is something behind that whole strategy. I will one day, maybe in a year or so, I will come out with a book and say, hey, I converted to Christianity and here is my story. That's how I will probably do it, I guess. I'm not sure at this point. Mango T made a super chat and said, birds born in a cage think flying is an illness. Best summarizes Islam. Thank you for that addition. Allah Azza wa Jal said, nothing. It just made a super chat. I appreciate it very much. Thank you so much. Allah made a super chat here. Thank you, Allah. Raman Sharifi made a super chat. Didn't say anything. I appreciate it. Rakesh Govindaraj said, secret Christian. Yeah, I am a secret Christian. Don't you know? Do you not know that I'm a secret Christian? And finally, again, Allah made another super chat and said, I am the greatest of deceivers. Read my book. Duh. Very nice. Very nice. I appreciate it.
At least he's admitting it.
Yeah. Ramin Sharif, he said, well, he admitted it in the Quran too. So that's the thing. That's what I like about Allah. He is at least a little bit honest about his intentions there. Ramin Sharif, he made a super chat and said, Ehrman made that silly remark about Quran being better copied book since he knew it would be circulated around by Muslims. As a scholar, he was in no position to say such a thing. Well, I mean, you could endlessly argue about why he said it, to what extent it can be applied, how authoritative he is on the matter. I think we've very much covered that. But if we talk to scholars who specifically focus on Quran preservation, there are a lot of people. I had an interview with Shad Nasser. You can watch it there. He spoke very, very openly and honestly. He said, it is a book that is written in a high register. It is among Arabic literature. It has been preserved carefully from a certain point, which is no surprise because these people cared so much about preserving it carefully. But the issue is we cannot go beyond that. We don't know where it came from. We cannot trace it back to a single source. We don't know if that single source was exactly the same as the Qurans that we have today, and so on. And that is the final opinion that you have. You can't go further than that.
And let me just add to that. I believe that the Quran has been well preserved.
Mm-hmm.
Like even going into the disagreements that led up to the burning of the Quran and so on. You have a couple of Muhammad's top reciters disagreeing on which chapters are supposed to go into the Quran, but they agreed on the vast majority of the chapters that are supposed to go into the Quran, right? So they have disagreements about Surah 1, Surah 113, Surah 114. Those are all short chapters. And then Ubay ibn Ka'b thought that there were 2 additional small surahs that are supposed to be in there. But notice, that doesn't change most of the Quran. And you have, textual variants throughout the Quran, the Quran manuscripts and so on. So they had differences and so on, and then you had even then you had the different qira'ats, and you had differences there, and even you have differences in the Quran today, but you don't get something that's teaching something wildly different from Islam. And I think that what you have today pretty much goes back to the time of Muhammad. I'd say the exact same thing about the New Testament. So you only run into problems here when you guys start saying perfect preservation and claiming that the New Testament is just it's completely different Bibles all over the place and so on. I don't know why. Well, I do know why you can't be honest, because if you were honest, then you wouldn't have the argument that you like to use. But the argument you like to use is perfect preservation of the Quran right down to the letter, and New Testament is just a mess. And then you'll take something that Ehrman says, where you could make this claim. Again, you'd have to do the counting. Now, one, there are way more New Testament manuscripts than there are Quran manuscripts, but you'd have to calculate how many variants per Quran manuscript, and then say, okay, if we had the 5,800 manuscripts that Christians have, how many would we average, and so on, and make some sort of claim about that and say Quran's been better preserved and so on. But you just can't do that. You never can. You have to perfect preservation right down to the letter, no variant ever. And it's just you have to. Your apologists and scholars, yet they have to lie. Why is it? Why does true religion need lies?
Here's the thing: many people argue a lot about the Quran preservation, and I know when the whole scandal happened last year and continued this year about the Quran not being perfectly preserved.
Narrative.
Yeah. It was amazing. It was very nice. It was very
Awesome.
It was hilarious. The issue is, I made a whole video about why I don't really care about the preservation of the Quran. It's because I don't deny that there is a preservation that is good, but that's what you expect. I would expect the Muslims to preserve the Quran perfectly. They are supposed to preserve it perfectly, because that is the big claim. That is the core claim of this religion. They are supposed to preserve it perfectly. It wouldn't be very impressive that they did it. They are supposed to do that. That's what you would expect from them. The issue is, it doesn't really matter. I mean, to me, it doesn't really matter. I think a miraculous preservation or a near miraculous preservation, even that in that case it wouldn't be miraculous, would be if we had a physical book that came into existence in Muhammad's time while he was there during his prophethood. It came, or maybe even it descended from the sky, I don't know, and that book still exists exactly as it was, with Muhammad's signature on it. That to me would be a fantastic, perfect preservation. Of course, we don't have that. Why don't we have that? That would be a preservation, as I see it. We don't have it. What we have are manuscripts that apparently lead back to a certain source. Yes. And the issue is, I could even say, hey, maybe it was perfectly preserved from Muhammad's time. Maybe it is exactly as Muhammad spoke it. But the issue is, even if that is the case, so why in the world would I trust this book that was apparently perfectly preserved, but that is also very stupid, and that doesn't have much knowledge in it, that is in contradiction with the knowledge that we have about the natural world, that says a lot of ridiculous things, that contradicts with knowledge that we get from different religions, and so on. I mean, it is not a source of great knowledge. I don't care how preserved it is. That's the issue.
And, I'm still stuck. I'm still stuck on the why do you need to lie about the? I mean, why do the apologists and scholars always need to lie?
Yeah.
And then the ones who tell the truth, they get into all sorts of trouble, right?
Yeah.
When you have someone like Yasser Qadi starts, I don't want to say, got some problems here. Don't have this conversation in front of people, and Hijab pushes them on it anyway. Then there's a huge backlash. How dare you state some facts?
And then you have to delete the whole podcast.
You have to delete the whole thing because you're in too much trouble over it.
Yeah. It's like, you can't do that. Hani made a super chat and said, if everything had a beginning, what came before God? Yeah. That's not a question that I want to go into right now with David. That would be a whole live stream.
Yeah, and
But-
you'd have to say who's agreeing here that everything had a beginning.
Yeah, yeah.
Right? If you want to say the universe had a beginning,
Exactly.
agreed. If you want to say
Exactly.
everything had a beginning, you'd need some sort of argument for that.
There is the issue that's where my whole problem with cosmological arguments starts to begin with, and with the specifically with the Kalam cosmological argument starts to begin with. It makes certain assumptions in its premise that you need to first argue on for a very long time, and I don't think we have time for that today anymore. Live through Romans 8:29 made a super chat and said, David, how can you miss Romans 9:5, where the scripture directly refers to the Messiah as God?
I think that comment was from back when I was reading Philippians 2.
Yes.
The reason I was quoting, you can quote multiple verses from the Apostle Paul where Jesus is clearly divine. I was quoting specifically chapter 2 of Philippians, because there Paul gives something, and he's not just saying it himself. He's saying something that was an early Christian hymn.
Mm-hmm.
So this had become, it would have become common to sing songs about the deity of Christ by that time. So showing that it doesn't seem to be as late as you'd expect, given Ehrman's theory. If you want Romans 9:5, to them belong the patriarchs, and from their race, according to the flesh, is the Christ, who is God over all, blessed forever.
Mm-hmm.
So
yeah,
the reason I wouldn't immediately go there for the discussion we're having is if someone says, who cares what the Apostle Paul says?
Yeah.
Maybe that was just the Apostle Paul. Whereas, with Philippians, it's something, he's quoting something else. He's quoting something else that was popular among Christians.
Absolutely. Oliver Spiridon, thank you, by the way, for the super chat. Oliver Spiridon, I already read that. Cedric said AP got destroyed by Ehrman. Can everyone please stop getting destroyed? Hard Ali Dawa. Oh yeah, man. I will publish a video tomorrow, probably, in which I will show how they distort footage, and then probably another one in which I will challenge Alidawa to present proof that I said to him very horrible
It's
things.
good. Yeah, I recorded a video earlier that I'm going to post, but I think tomorrow I'm going to get back to. I've been wanting to go through. You and I talked about this a while back. I want to keep going through the scientific claims.
I know
they're so bad, but it's like the Islamic apologist approach is, let's throw out so many lies so quickly no one can ever respond to them all. And that's just the response. So if we keep lying about the Quran, keep lying about the Bible, keep lying about Jesus, keep lying about Muhammad, keep lying about science, keep lying about all these things, keep lying about all the other atheists and Christians out there, we just keep lying to everyone, then eventually they'll eventually give up because they won't be able to respond to all the lies. Interesting stuff. I got that book too.
I got this book because you asked me to look at this. This is from the Honorable Medical Doctor Zakir Naik about the Quran and modern science. This is one of the dumbest books that I've ever read. I have to be very honest about this. I'm very sorry. I have to be so blunt, but it's one of the it's one of the dumbest books that I've ever read in my life. It's horrible. I'm serious. I'm not exaggerating. I read Islamic books that are good. I read Islamic books that are actually good. I read books by Islamic scholars that are actually, very well written and that actually, seem to make sense. It's just that their premise is very flawed. But this book here, it's so dumb.
Yeah, and the real problem is, see, there are situations where someone can say something that's completely false, and I don't think he's lying. I just think he's mistaken, right? Like when a Muslim comes up to me and tells me, "Oh, the Quran contains this miracle," I don't think he's trying to deceive me. He's listened to someone else. That book, which by the way is almost word for word from his lecture on the subject, it contains numerous so-called scientific miracles where if you've actually read the passage, there's no way you could say that with a straight face, right?
In other words, lying.
In other words, he's clearly lying. And this goes back to what we're talking about earlier. I mean, think about this: hijab, Ali Dawa, Zakir Naik, all of it. Like, the bigger the liar you are, the more popular you become. And why is that the case in this religion?
Yeah, absolutely. All right. We'll come to that. We should definitely go through those things in this book. That would be fantastic. When we should debunk them one by one. We'll talk about that. Basic made a super chat and said Muslims are going to clip the part of the video where David said the Quran has been preserved. David is a secret Muslim. We should do that. I should do that. Oliver Spiridon said, I have a master diploma. I am a medical doctor. And finally, Monica Benet said something, but then retracted the comment. But I appreciate it. Thank you so much. All right, that's it. David, that was good. We are at 3 hours. That is good too. I think it's time for us to go and to be back very soon with more. What do you think?
Yep. Oh, and I've got a video to post.
Oh, yeah, you should post that video. Come back.
Should be up in about 15 minutes.
15 minutes. Oh,
15 minutes.
Okay. I have to go do lots of different things, but then we will come back with some projects together as well soon. All right, everybody. Thank you for viewing. Thanks for this very nice stream. I think this was very beneficial. By the way, did you see my my parody video of of Bart Ehrman and Mohammed Hijab? It's called Bart Ehrman Roasts Islam. Did you
No,
see?
Why is it good?
Let's watch it together. I don't know if you've seen the interview of Bart Ehrman and Mohammed Hijab.
No, I did not.
I kind of made a parody of it.
I heard it. I heard it was similar to the Yasser Qadi interview, in that it didn't go the way.
It was disastrous, and
Yeah.
I just made a parody with the. It's a very obvious joke video. I'm not distorting his answers, but just making fun of it. Here.
Okay.
Wait a minute. Share.
Hey, based on someone's comment that I saw earlier today, I thought it would be fun. A skit we could do is like, I'm a scientist. I'm at a chalkboard trying to figure out the equation for life, and you're behind me as a Muslim apologist with a pen and paper, and I look back and say, "Hey, what are you doing there?" And you say, "Oh, I'm just waiting for you to figure out some new scientific fact so I can." So I can find it in the Quran somewhere.
we could totally. And I have a
It'd be like a 35-second skit.
All right. So this is Bart Ehrman.
Does it mean to be unreliable?
Muslims believe in Jesus Christ. There's a lot of interest, I think, from the Muslim community, and many Muslims feel that your conclusions, or historical conclusions of who Jesus Christ is more commensurate with the Muslim idea than it is with the Christian one.
I wouldn't say that they line up well with the Muslim view. I really do think Jesus was crucified and that he really was dead and buried. Interested in whether Jesus was the Son of God, because I don't think there was a God. And so
my understanding is that your conclusion is that Jesus Christ was a messianic prophet.
I think he thought that he was a son of God, in the sense that he was specially chosen by God. I think Jesus really did think he was going to be the Messiah, the future king of Israel. I mean, that is, after all, why they crucified him. I think that that's historically right. I think that all of these gospel authors, I think all of them think that in some sense, Jesus is God. If you think that the Bible cannot have any mistakes in it, if you're shown a mistake, then you just refuse to admit it's a mistake. You think either it can be reconciled in some way, or that there's something we just don't understand about it, or, we have, and
in the Quran, it's mentioned that mother than God would have found in it many contradictions.
If a book is without contradictions, that has no bearing on whether it comes from God or not. I've had phone books that are inerrant, but I certainly don't think God gave them. That is my view.
It's a necessary condition for a book from God not to have contradictions.
That's an assumption about what kind of book God could write. I know this is an important argument that apologists use for Islam. As somebody who is not either Christian or Muslim, it doesn't make sense to me for humans to say what God has to do. If God wants to make a revelation, it has to be this, this, or that. You're talking about somebody who's beyond your imagination.
Well, there has to be something within revelation which distinguishes it from human speech, so as to act as an evidence.
Yes, I know that's your argument. I'm saying, who says it has to be? You are.
If it's not, then anyone can claim prophecy or prophethood, right?
Well, the Christians say that's what the Christians say all Muslims are doing. They're just claiming things for themselves.
in the past, prophets came with kind of visual miracles. The final prophet, who we believe Prophet Muhammad, he came with something that can be analyzable in our times. If it's analyzable in a sense that you can distinguish it from human speech, and so this would be the argument that we would put forward.
Yeah, no, I know, and I don't buy it. Suppose he did not call himself God. That would not mean he's not God. I don't call myself a pain in the neck, but that's a pain in the neck. And I don't buy it.
Yeah. So.
Oh, wow. Yo, but do you notice the mentality of your job? We're talking about how deceptive the apologists and scholars are. Again, I'm not talking about Muslims in general, although I wish they'd be a little more careful about the guys they're talking to. But their goal now, because they're drowning so horribly. The guys are drowning so horribly. The goal seems to be, let's interview some guys who don't know a lot about Islam, so we can say whatever we want, and we can use them help them be our kind of megaphone to reach their fans with all this stuff about Islam, and they're not going to know enough to correct it. And so, hey, let's see if we can get an interview with Bart Ehrman. He doesn't know a lot about Islam. Let's see if we can get an interview with Jordan Peterson. Let's see if we can get interviews with these guys, and that way we can deceive. It's this race. Can we deceive people faster than other people can correct all the lies? And it's like, okay, we've got our method now. It's not working very well. Let's get a bunch of these other guys on our shows to try to get more of a following, so we can ramp up the speed of our deception. And wow, I don't know how reflective that was of the entire thing. But yeah, based on those clips, that look like, it's funny because I mean, how dumb can you be? Do you really think Ehrman's going to go, wow, you're saying your book, blah 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 blah? I guess I'll convert to Islam. How do I do it? How do I do that? By the way, oh, no problem, brother. You just recite this. Oh, okay, la ilaha illallah. Like, they're really expecting Ehrman to agree with
Oh boy!
Wow.
It's so funny. He was like, he had this interview for about 40 minutes with him, and he used like half of it just to preach to Bart Ehrman about how amazing Islam is.
Wow.
And you can see it in his face. He's just like,
what's amazing is,
oh my god,
there's a reason for the deception. I mean, apart from you have to deceive if your position is not correct. But I mean, you've got Ehrman there, and I can almost guarantee, if you laid out the facts about disagreements among Muhammad's scholars, I mean, early Quran reciters, the burning of the Qurans and things like that, I guarantee you Ehrman would get pretty darn suspicious of what's going on. Mm-hmm. But it's become so, the myth of perfect preservation has become so popular that it's just spread. So people think that the Quran has been really, 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 really well preserved. Even if they don't grant perfect preservation, they still tend to think it's been really, really well preserved. And no, you got some big issues in there. If you wanted to say well preserved, I wouldn't have a terrible problem with it. But
absolutely,
they can't say it. They can't say pretty well preserved. They can't do it. They can't say pretty well preserved. It's like okay, here's the evidence. We have to lie. Yeah. We have to tell a lie here. We cannot just state the facts.
Yeah, all I want to say is
what does it mean?
That was terrible.
Maybe.
And I don't buy it.
Oh boy, that was good.
He seems like a funny guy.
He is a funny guy.
And notice the I mean, just the different mindset that we're talking about earlier, that respecting people and so on. You and I get along with each other. We get along with. We don't have much of a problem getting along with most people. But you got the Muslim apologists, and they just view everyone as their enemy who has to be crushed and destroyed.
Yeah.
And they'll put up with you insofar as they can twist what you're saying to get some benefit to Islam. Other than that, you have to be destroyed. But it's not just people they view like that. Notice it's everything, right? The Bible is something that we're to try and squeeze out some proof of Islam, and science is something that we have to twist and stretch and try to squeeze out something for Islam, and each person is something we have to try and twist and squeeze out some evidence for Islam, and there's just this perpetual rage that it's not going on. Gosh, anyone remember what that myth was? There's that Greek myth. There's a Greek myth where it was an innkeeper, and he had a bed, and he would make sure people fit the bed, right? And if you were too short, it would like stretch you out until you fit the bed exactly. And if you were too tall, he would like chop your feet off until you fit the bed exactly. But that's like what Muslim apologists do, right? It's nothing is fitting what you're saying, and so you just have to keep stretching. You have to keep stretching things and chopping stuff up to get them to agree.
Procrustes, the Procrustean.
Procrusti, yeah.
Yeah, Procrust. Yeah, that's it. Okay. All right. Okay. Fantastic. I'm glad that we went through that at the end. It's hard for me to gather myself. I had to.
Pretty disrespectful towards Muhammad Hijab doing that.
Yeah, he did some really hard work there, and I should be respecting that a little bit more. It's just very sad. I feel sad for him. That's why I feel bad about laughing. Yeah. So thanks for joining, everybody. Thanks for watching. Thanks for being here. I will see you again very, very soon. We will see you again very, very soon. Have a fantastic day. Oliver Spiriton made a final super chat and said, "Sister, don't go to AP and DW. They are the enemy of." Oh yeah, did you see that video too? That was like a while ago. This guy Hamza. Because there was this Muslim convert girl who came to our stream and made like nice comments on our stream, and then the other Muslims started attacking her, and then this Hamza guy made this video about her and said, "Don't go to the enemy, don't, get close with the likes of apostate prophet and David Wood. They are the enemies of Islam, and the Muslims, they hate them more than they love you." It was. I should send you that afterwards. You should look at that. Anyway, all right. Thanks, everybody. Thank you, David. See you again, everyone. Have a fantastic day. Good night, good day, good evening if you're on Earth or Mars. And as always, David, do you want to do the honor?
Dawah is deception.
Oh, yeah.
Ha ha! You all thought I was going to say stay away from Islam.
Well, that's good too. Yeah,
I'm no sheep.
Oh yeah. But don't you know that the true believers are those who hear and they say, "We hear and we have obey. We hear and we obey." That's what you're supposed to do according to the Quran.
Okay, fine. Stay away from Islam.
Thanks.